Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Sorry to cut the music off on you. I know people were jamming in their own spaces. It's so great to see, not to see you. I mean, I'm so happy that you all have joined us in this amazing workshop series. We are so really, truly heartened by the number of people that are joining us and the real interest in investing in our mobilization effort to prevent trauma and foster resilience. And so this is our 5th workshop. And as we always say, it's designed to activate and equip our local coalitions to integrate trauma-informed practices and policies into all sectors of their communities and ultimately throughout our society. And it does require a collective effort by all of you and all the people, systems, and policies that you become engaged in through this process. So we have an absolutely amazing session planned for you today. But first, I just want to introduce the organizers of this workshop series. We have CTIP, the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, out front, and the PACES Connection, which is formerly the ACES Connection, and the National Prevention Science Coalition to Improve Lives, which is the organization that I represent. And just a plug for that, to see our website at the bottom there, and you can go to it to find resources for this workshop series. These are our co-sponsors. We have about 15 co-sponsors here, and I just wanted you to take a look at all the beautiful organizations that are on board with us, and it is continuing to grow in terms of our organizational sponsorship and support. And they're truly inspiring this movement in so many ways. So today's workshop number 5, is building the movement with populations with a high prevalence of historical and ongoing trauma. So we're going to start with the introduction that I'm giving to you right now. And others are going to speak from PACES and from, well, PACES is going to start off the workshop, but 2 others from CTIP, the founders and directors of CTIP, are going to be speaking to you about the future. And then we're going to have this agenda where we're going to start with PACES, the CEO of PACES, Ingrid Cockren, talking about historical trauma and racial healing. And then we'll go to Captain Joshua Strait, who will give us a lens through to the military families and the unique challenges that they experience as a developmental behavioral pediatric fellow. We also have Euldana, Thorne, and Vichi, Jagannathan, I hope I pronounced that right, Vichi, with the Resilience Leaders Initiative, which is a social accelerator in rural communities. We will also hear from someone about violence interruption with the highest rates of gun in areas and the highest rates of gun violence in New York City, Bain. We'll have a short brain break that Jesse Kohler will organize for us. Then we'll come back and we'll learn about mindfulness strategies for children with exposure to trauma in low-income urban schools and communities, led by Ali Smith of the Holistic Life Foundation. We also have Tami Decoteau that will speak about the unique challenges of Native Americans who have experienced historical trauma. And then Dr. Susan Rose and Tom Lebel will speak to us about incarcerated and substance-dependent parents and the intergenerational impacts of that. And then finally, a Share Your Story with Sherrie Rickerson. And then we'll have a recap and we will talk more concertedly about the future. These are our next workshops. I want to just mention them now, mention them again at the end, but just for those who are joining early, these are our next workshops. We've added one, please take note, that will now happen on the 29th of April. So our next one will be with foundations. Following that, we will have a how-to session, how to activate and equip community coalitions. The one after that will address wicked problems. And the one after that will be policy and advocacy. So please make note. Our resource center is still under development. We've been getting so many wonderful resources. It's a lot of information to organize for your accessibility. So that is coming. And then finally, housekeeping. There's an important update. We are going to provide certificates of attendance to all those who do attend. We were hoping to have them available today. It probably won't be until Monday, but we will go back to all of the workshop sessions, including this one, and be able to send you a certificate for your attendance. As you already have noticed, you are free to chat with one another in the chat box. It provides a sense of community and connectedness for all of us, so please do feel free. But also note that any questions that are submitted to the chat we won't see, because what we see is a running tally of messages and we can't keep track. So if you have an actual Q&A, please go to the Q&A box to submit it. We try as best we can to monitor that. To some we apply in writing, to others speakers will address. The invitation link that you've been using for your workshops to date, please keep it because it will be active for the rest of the workshop series. It's the same link. Please expect an email from us to complete a brief survey afterwards so that we can evaluate ourselves. The link to that survey is also on the website. We welcome your input. If we have a breakout session generally after each one, and if the session ends too soon, the link to the breakout room can be found on our respective websites. So you can check that just in case you feel like you've lost a connection. And then finally, all the recordings, the handouts, the PowerPoints, the websites, and other resources will appear on our websites a few days after each workshop. So please feel free to check often. Okay, now I am going to go to the very Dan Press. I'm going to stop my share. Thank you again for joining.
Hi, Denny.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm asking you to start video.
Oh, it didn't.
You'll be able to click. There you go. Perfect.
There we go.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Press. I'm the general counsel and one of the founders of CTIP. I'm going to be real quick because we want to get onto our agenda. But in lieu of the standard land acknowledgement, I just wanted to share my own personal experience. Getting out of law school, I spent 4 years on the lands of the Diné Navajo people as a legal services attorney. And the last 50 years after that, as an attorney for tribes representing tribes all over the country, from the Everglades all the way up to Barrow, Alaska. And the two lessons I want to offer from that 50 years of experiences. One is the devastating effect historical trauma has had on Native American communities, the high suicide rates, the high substance abuse rates, and the high obesity and diabetes rates. And secondly is the vital culture that has managed to survive and even thrive despite the 4 centuries of genocide. And the work of all of us are doing all over the country to address trauma can help the Native communities and all the other communities that have suffered historical trauma and childhood trauma. There's so much upside waiting for us. So we look forward to the presentations of our representatives today. And thank you all for the great work that you're doing, helping to make trauma-informed programs a reality throughout the country. Denny, I'd now like to introduce Jesse Kohler, who is the Executive Director of CTIP. Jesse?
Thanks, Dan. Dan is such an incredible leader in this space, and I'm so fortunate to have him as a mentor. Denny, I cannot turn on my camera, but that's okay. And I just will keep this again very, very quick because we are already over time. And so I want to be able to hand this off to Ingrid very quickly. So I will just put a plug in that we will do another presentation for CTIP at the next session, where we will have more time to sort of dive into all of the work from CTIP. But I just put 2 links into the chat for folks to be able to see. One is that I want to invite folks to the CTIP CAN call that is going to be on March 16th. CTIP CAN is always the 3rd Wednesday of every month from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. And this coming month, we are going to have presentations from North Carolina that are going to focus on how the Press On initiative, that coalition of coalitions that we've discussed so many times, is actualizing in a particular state, where we partner with the states, and then the state has connections with 42 communities. And you'll be able to really hear about the work that they are all doing, which is going to be fantastic. And also want to put out another call for folks to join the National Trauma Campaign and become part of the advocacy network, where we are illustrating a groundswell of support for trauma-informed, resilience-focused, and healing-centered policies and practices across the country and frankly around the world. We could not possibly do this work without all of you. The lived experiences, the stories, the insights that you have, the boots on the ground sort of relationships that you all have and can develop as constituents with your elected officials and their staff are so, so critical. So again, more to come on the National Trauma Campaign, the CTIP Can Call, Press On initiative, and other initiatives from CTIP at the next call where we can have a little bit more time. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to the Executive Director of PACE's Connection, the incredible Ingrid Cockren, for a great presentation on historical trauma. So Ingrid, take it away.
Thank you, Jesse, and I hope everyone can hear me. I've always told I'm soft-spoken. Again, my name is Ingrid Cockren. I am the CEO of PACE's Connection. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. And what we're going to talk about today is a very important topic that I always like to give a bit of a disclaimer whenever we're going to talk about race or historical trauma, just because these types of topics are generally polarizing in our society. So I definitely want to put out there that this is informational. It is meant to be in no way harming in any way. And I definitely want everyone to have an open mind and be open to our discussions today. So as we talked about before, this discussion is focused on historical trauma. We will talk about several different groups that will be considered vulnerable due to historical trauma. Just to give some background about my organization, PACE's Connection is a social network that is dedicated to the 5 tenets of PACE's science, so epidemiology, the impact that trauma has on the brain, on the body, on our DNA or epigenetics, and of course, resilience. We really focus on supporting communities. Again, we are a social network built to support communities to solve their most intractable problems. Currently, we have over 430 communities represented on our site, which is pacesconnection.com. And we just hit 55,000 members this week, actually. So as I am newly taking over the helm of executive director, what we're really focused on in the coming years is equity and healing centered practices, and definitely increasing the awareness of historical and collective trauma. And this visual provided by one of our communities from North Carolina is a great way to visualize ACEs and trauma beyond what we would normally focus on, which are individual ACEs. We want to begin to have a clear understanding of collective trauma and how those collective traumas can then become historical trauma as they are passed on through generations through a process called intergenerational transmission. So the purpose of this conversation today is to really help everyone to begin to see the absence of positive childhood experiences and ACEs as a social justice issue. When we look at historical trauma, the term itself is really what we call intergenerational transmission of trauma. However, it is more likely to occur in groups that are defined by cultural delineation like race or nationality. The term itself was coined in the 80s by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is a Native American social worker, and is defined as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations that emanates from a massive group trauma. Dr. Braveheart also says that it is accompanied by what we call historical unresolved grief. So this is a presentation that I've been giving since about 2015. When I first started, I would give this presentation and people would literally get up and leave the room. Obviously, this was pre-COVID. But I have noticed that since 2020, people have been a lot more interested in this phenomenon as known as historical trauma. Here you'll see that the groups most impacted are Indigenous or Native Americans, African Americans, specifically those who are descendants of American slavery, individuals living in generational poverty, members of the LGBTQI community, refugees, survivors of natural disasters and other widespread traumatic events, obviously children and adolescents because their age increases their vulnerability, war veterans, and then Latino and Muslim Americans. I have an asterisk near them because their historical trauma may be connected to more recent events like 9/11 or the discussion of immigration in our political spheres. And so that's why that asterisk is there. So as you look at this list, definitely think about what intersectionality looks like. So refugees of color, LGBTQI youth, children and adolescents. When you have intersectionality between these groups, it increases their vulnerability. When we think about what historical trauma looks like and how it manifests in our society, you'll see here, there's the vulnerability to PTSD and other stress related disorders. I won't read all of them, but these are issues that are embedded within communities who have experienced historical trauma and increases the likelihood that they will have these symptoms. Let's see. As you can see here, some of these are controversial, especially if we, as we relate these topics to issues of race and issues of nationality or ethnicity. And the reason why this is the case is because we live in a country where we have kind of pushed ourselves into a corner in the way that we talk about race and historical trauma. And we have been kind of duped into this understanding that genetic race is a real thing, and it is not. And so because we are so race focused in America, we are unable to have real conversations about race and ethnicity when it comes to these issues. And often we are in the space of blaming the victims. And so racism is a real problem in America. It is deeply embedded within our history. And the way that we look at the issue will allow us to have more effective ways of resolving those issues. And so racism and xenophobia in America are systemic issues and thus must have systemic solutions. And so the RISE Center out of California has done a great job of helping us to visualize what it would mean to address issues of historical trauma within our work. So first, as you can see on the dehumanization and distress side of this visual, we have all the ways in which trauma is embedded within our systems. So we tend to focus on the individual and an interpersonal level. So this is where individual ACEs occurs. Also, this is where generational transmission, as we deal with work with families and the parent-child interactions or caregiver-child interactions. However, this visual helps us to see that we are impacted at a systemic level. And when we look at the systems that are impacting our development as human beings, we must then consider neighborhoods, communities, institutions, and definitely our history and legacy and the structure of our environment. And when we do this, this is what we would call a social ecological model. This is based on Bronfenbrenner's work. He's a child psychologist that really began our basic understanding that children develop within systems, not just homes, but again, neighborhoods, schools, institutions, and their lives are impacted by issues of policy and definitely our overall or what we call the macro system, where that houses our beliefs and values. Obviously, these issues are closely tied to identity. And in my work with PACES Connection, I have definitely pushed us forward in our understanding of how we address ACEs beyond just kind of our blanket strategy of all children, all families. The truth is that because of historical trauma, we need to have different strategies based on groups that have experienced high levels of trauma if we want to be equitable. So all children, all families as a strategy is not exactly equity, it is equality. Equity means that we are basically giving more resources and attention and higher level interventions to groups and families who have long been underserved and under-resourced because of racism and other systemic issues. And as you look on the other side of this visual where it says liberation and healing, this is where all of our work should reside. At the individual level, we need to honor the resilience and fortitude of individuals and families. At the community level, we need to build beloved community. And this is extremely important because when we think about community work, herein lies where we do the most work. One of the interventions that's listed under Build Beloved Community is a radical inquiry, and this is what we're engaging in today. This is making sure that everyone understands how systems work and how they are impacting us. And so if I give an example of an individual child that is living in a neighborhood that is mostly African-American, who may be experiencing high levels of gun violence in their neighborhood, who may be experiencing high levels of poverty and looks around their neighborhood and sees that the majority of their neighborhood looks like them. A child will see this and believe the messages from the larger society, which is that the reason for this environmental distress or atmospheric distress is because my skin is Black or brown. And that's not the truth. The truth is that the reason why some neighborhoods are impacted by higher levels of violence or poverty is directly related to policy and decision-making and the structure of the country that we live in. Policies like redlining and issues of housing discrimination are more likely to be the reason why certain neighborhoods look the way they do. If we let this child believe that their skin color is the reason why their neighborhoods are reflecting in this way, then we will then see poor racial identity development in that child. What this means is that we need to engage in radical inquiry so that there's an understanding of how systems are at play, that racism is shaping our country, that racism is impacting our health outcomes, that racism is impacting our educational outcomes, and that this needs to be something that everyone is aware of so that we can actually address racism as opposed to having a narrative that everyone has the same potential to succeed in this country. And so you will receive this visual, and this will help us to think through how do we address issues of racism in our neighborhoods, and how do we have an equity focus when we are interacting with communities and individuals who have a historically traumatic background, and also individuals of any race that are dealing with intergenerational transmission of trauma. So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. I want to have some space to answer any questions that may come up briefly. I know that we're running a little bit behind, but again, thank you for your attention during this presentation. And if you want to contact me, here is my email address. I will also put it in the chat.
Thanks, Ingrid. There are some questions in the Q&A. If you can type out responses, that would be really great. But this was a great way to kick off, I think, the this workshop session. Please continue to put questions into the chat or into the Q&A that Ingrid can engage with. But our next presenter is Captain Joshua Strait, who is a developmental pediatric fellow with the Air Force. Captain Strait, turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Jesse. And thank you everyone for making this meeting possible. As far as a disclaimer goes, I just need to say that my perspective, my views don't represent that of the United States military, any branch therein, or the Department of Defense. But I am very grateful to be here. I really enjoy my job working as an active duty officer in the United States military. I work at Madigan Army Medical Center in the state of Washington, and my specialty is in developmental behavioral pediatrics. And if any of you are not familiar with that, I actually didn't know about it until I was in medical school. And my work, my passion for building resilience in families helped gravitate me towards this field. And I work with mainly families with children with special needs. And I diagnose, I manage, I try to administer or facilitate therapy within my sessions and counseling and to do my best to interact with these wonderful families that I work with. And because of this particular profession, I am exposed to all kinds of stories and situations that I had not imagined prior to me joining the military. So being a parent is stressful. Being a parent with a child that has special needs is additionally stressful. And then either having one parent or both parents being in the military is also stressful. So sometimes these families are facing what seems to be impossible challenges to work through. And so I feel privileged to be in a situation where understanding the effect of toxic stress and the risk factors that can lead to it can have on the development and the wellness of that child and their family at large throughout the lifespan. What I've understood in my practice, and since really engrossing myself into ACEs science and resilience, is that we understand when these events happen, it alters the brain, the way that it's connected. It alters a child's ability to attach to another human being. It alters their perception of themselves and the world around them. It's also telling of what we actually need as human beings. That's why I really appreciate the fact that Paces Connection have transformed their name to Paces Connection, so that we focus on the positive experiences, because every one of us as human beings, we need stable relationships. We need a family. We need connection. We need healthy touch. We need to feel like we can be safe and that we can be respected and that we belong as part of this human family, and that whether it's our gender, our religion, our race, or our age, or whatever else it is not a disqualifier from being part of this important human experience. So in my practice, and I want to give some examples of what it looks like in working with military families, I want to focus on a strengths-based approach. So helping a family understand, let's build up particular events and connections and things that can really help your child and your family continue to move forward. As many of you are probably familiar with, military families are at high risk for stress that can lead to toxic stress, high risk for divorce, high risk for mental illness in the home, high risk for abuse, particularly around times of deployment, either before or after deployment, and obviously for mental illness in the home if one parent or both parents suffer from PTSD. What we also understand from recent data is that a lot of those who join the military are more likely to have a history of ACEs. And we don't know exactly the explanation, but it just calls to reason that perhaps those who've experienced traumatic stress are gravitate towards something like the military that can provide them this opportunity to receive an education, to travel, to receive extra experiences, and to have health insurance, and to have something that they know they can provide for their family. So understanding that every family I meet with, I understand they are already at higher risk for having experienced a dysfunctional childhood themselves. And it helps me foster a lens of compassion in any conversation that I have with them. One thing I want to focus on too is that systems, just like Ingrid just said, thank you, Ms. Cockren, for that, because systems perpetuate trauma. And that is in the world of medicine, and it's in the world of military. And sometimes I feel like the systems we have to operate in foster a sense of disconnection. And so the way they're employed increases disconnection. And in my role too, it almost feels like that system wants us to be more about someone who does something, to do something. And, oh, this family experienced this, what are you going to do? I found that being trauma informed is not so much about doing, but it's about fostering a human connection and engaging a family where they can actually engage their personal tools and their skills to be able to heal and go through a grieving process and move forward. Ultimately teaching that child that principle of adaptability and resilience and bouncing back. I think another thing, particularly in the military, is understanding what the mission is. And I remember in my officer training, we talked about the mission as being so important. And unfortunately, sometimes that mission is misinterpreted as job comes first and then family. I'm hopeful that more and more leaders within the military are recognizing that the ultimate mission is the families that we are seeking to serve. If we can build up each and every family, we increase our national defenses, we increase our health and prosperity and happiness and thriving and adaptability. And that's also, I feel like, part of my role is acknowledging the sometimes incredibly challenging tension that caregivers in the military have to hold of their duties to the United States military and also at home with their families. And recognizing that the most important work that they will ever do is within the walls of their own home. And as I employ that in my conversations, I feel fortunate enough to have experienced this softening of a weight on some of these family shoulders of, okay, I can better understand this, again, this tension that I'm holding, and I can feel equipped. So I want to give a couple of examples, and these are all recent and even some ongoing patients that I see regularly. So the first one is not a patient of mine. He's a gentleman who I actually met in an airport, he's not even working in the same military installation that I'm working at, but he was on his way home to his wife who was critically ill. They've been apart for almost 3 years now because of his duty, because of his mission. He was called to a particular area to focus on training other soldiers. He opened up to me about the stress that he's under, and he hadn't slept for 3 days to try to get permission from his commander to be able to travel to his critically ill wife. And he told me that about 2 years prior, his wife had a miscarriage, and they wouldn't let him go down to be with her. And it was, again, almost full-term pregnancy. He was ready to leave in about a month or two. They wouldn't let him go. And she was very depressed, obviously, and grieving the loss of their expectant child. And he told me that it was him having to have a breakdown and become incredibly angry, where they're like, okay, take 30 days, you go ahead and go down. And this prompted in me this idea, again, of the mission. What's the most important thing? And he taught them, and he taught me as well, that as we nurture the people, the men and women and the systems that we operate in, we nurture their need for human connection and their stable family relationships, then the job's going to get done. But if we neglect that, then not only is the job not going to get done, they're going to suffer, and it's going to take a while to recover. And he opened up and said that it took him a while afterwards to kind of, in a way, bounce back from it. But he gained some skills and resilience. And he said that he approached his commander this time and said, look, my wife's very sick and I have to go be with her. So we have two choices here. And I was very inspired by what he said. And that's helped change my practice. As I work with families, I want to be bold, but loving. I want to have compassion, but I want to have firm boundaries. And this next child that I want to talk about is that exact scenario where I had to boldly say something that I knew was going to be a difficult thing to hear. There's a family that I work with where I work with 3 of the children. They all have special needs, and one of which is incredibly medically complex and has multiple reasons for the family to be strained as far as visiting medical care often, the emergency room, subspecialists such as myself. But the family dynamic was such that what was happening was not working. So both families were active duty military, both parents, active duty military. And thankfully, because of extended family, a family member was able to come and live with them to help take care of the children. But while they're away to deployments and training, this caregiver would focus on these. There was a total of 4 children, 3 of them with special needs. And she herself needed emergent surgery. And not to make a very important story too long, but the command would not let the father take time off work to take care of the kids and spot his wife so she can visit the caregiver in the hospital. They refused to let him. Thankfully, the mother's command understood and says, yes, you can go home and be with your children. She was out for 3 days in the hospital after emergent surgery, but as soon as she got out, she had to go right back into taking care of these children, and the parents had to go right back to work. What I noticed on physical exam when I looked at 2 of those 3 children was they had severe tooth decay, and it was to the level where I needed to make a report. There were abscesses and rotting teeth that were coming out. And even though they had seen a dentist about a year and a half earlier, we generally recommend twice a year. This was evidence that I needed to tell the caregiver and the father, things are not working right now, and I'm going to get some more help. And so in the military, particularly in my installation, we have something called the MCHAT, so the Military Child Health Advocacy Team, where they involve something called family advocacy, and they contact CPS and they bring in a social worker and they say, and my approach is, this is something that's not working, but I'm going to help get other people involved that can build skills within the family. What I did not understand was that this father had CPS called on them when they were children, and he was put in foster care. So when I had this conversation, it triggered something inside of him. He does have a history of PTSD, both from the military, but also when he was in a childhood where he suffered significant physical abuse. He later told me that me even having this conversation triggered this thought, am I that horrible father like my father was? Is this doctor accusing me of neglecting my children like my father neglected and beat me? And thankfully, we had a very meaningful discussion where right now, due to the systems that we operate in and your commands not being compassionate and understanding the true priority of your family's health, we need to get other people involved. And this team, thankfully, is able to actually interact with the military, with command, and saying, look, this is what's happening. And then, of course, I was able to plug these kids into resources, which sometimes is needed, but not always. Because in my practice, I find the most important thing that I can do for that family is help them access the resources that they already have in place. And if they don't, I can make suggestions. Can I offer a suggestion? And I'll do it in such a way that I'm not telling them what they have to do. But I've learned the most important thing is to say, have you considered this? Some of the families I work with find that attending a religious organization, whether it's a church, a synagogue, a temple, or a mosque, can really help with a sense of purpose in the family and a means of communication and connection with others around them, and a spiritual endeavor and a spiritual health that's vital to all human beings. I'll even say, have you considered joining the YMCA so the family can regularly, exercise together and support children in basketball or swimming? And because I understand in the back of my mind and the training that I've received that a family that's more connected to others is more likely to bounce back from setbacks. The next patient that I want to discuss is, I will never forget him. Unfortunately, we call it PCS, so they had to move to a different station. But when I first met him, he almost seemed psychotic because of his behavior. But when I was able to, through a trauma-informed approach, understand what was going on in the home environment where both parents, prior active duty, had PTSD, significant PTSD from being deployed to conflict. And he was a difficult child. He had a difficult temperament, which increased the strain within the home. And when we could get to the foundation, the explanation for these natural reactions to abnormal circumstances, then I was able to help them understand, you're not a bad parent, he's not a bad son, and plug them in with a resource we call Focus. So Families Overcoming Stress, which is one of my favorite resources, where we have a non-medically based group of volunteers, some social workers and educators and others who are willing to sit down with parents, however many sessions they need to talk about conflict resolution and communication and how to literally overcome stress. And from when I first met this child to about a year later, I got to get to know him because he would communicate. He was bright, he made eye contact, and he was happy and cheerful. And mom, at one point, actually had tears in her eyes saying, we needed help. And I'm so grateful that we got the help. And that to me is a reminder that when I could have easily just diagnosed this child with something and given him a medication and said, see you in 6 months, good luck, could that really have helped the child? I don't know. But what I do know is that through this trauma-informed approach to this high-risk family and already being in the military with a history of trauma themselves, that child was able to receive extra connection in their home and feel loved and supported because the parents also got help for their PTSD. Another family of mine where the mother actually suffered a significant traumatic brain injury and severe memory loss and depression, felt isolated and alone, and her active duty husband was always away working 60, 70 hours a week and going away on deployments and training. She felt alone to manage their child with special needs. There was a constellation of things. We got him involved in neurofeedback therapy and behavioral health therapy and addressing medication that would substantially help him be at his best. And suggesting that mom get them involved in activities in the community. She was very isolating before and very depressed, as you can imagine. But she got involved with a Bible study group, and they got involved with Taekwondo, and she started making friends and he started making friends. And I started to really get to know this real child, this child that was not suffering with the adversity and the adverse circumstances. And then also inviting the dad to join, where we can talk about his military duties and understanding, again, when you get home, you're exhausted. And sometimes the best thing you can do is get on the floor with your son and play a video game with him, read a book with him, watch a movie, go for a walk, play basketball, do something for 5-10 minutes. And they've been practicing that where they have special dedicated time for the child. I'll use an anonymous name, Matthew, like Matthew special time. Every day, 10 minutes, set a timer. You don't direct him, you don't tell him what to do. You're just with him. And you can hug him and hold him and touch him. I also recognize that in the military, we have a very diverse population of men and women. And when I work with families of color, I make a point of it to point out that I acknowledge that you, if you want to be a doctor, you can be a doctor, and praise them for who they are, because I recognize the system I operate in and the nation, and me being a privileged white person, it's not as easy for people of color to recognize, well, if I want to be a doctor, I can be a doctor. And so I want to inspire that in these families, that it's okay for them to dream to become president or be a doctor and these things, and acknowledge the impact that racism is either currently having on that family or has had in the past. As I have my conversations about ACEs with them, I incorporate racism as something that can alter how someone feels about themselves or the world around them. In closing, I want to recap again my approach. And whether I'm working in a civilian hospital or at the military, I always counsel families on the importance of HEART. It's an acronym that I've grown fond of, where if you hug a child, you engage them, you ask questions, you read to them, and you talk to them. When you incorporate those things, you're building a sense of resilience from day one, where they can touch you and feel you and smell you, they see your eyes. And as they get older, as they know it's okay for dad and mom to ask questions like, how are you feeling today? How was school? Are you feeling safe? And they feel comfortable in talking about sex and peer pressure and those things as they get older. And it is okay to talk about feelings, because yeah, sometimes I'm angry too. And sometimes it's hard, and acknowledging those feelings and experiences. There's a book, Building Resilience in Children and Teens, by Dr. Ken Ginsberg, and he gives 7 C's of resilience, that if we can help every family, military family, and every child recognize that if they gain a sense of competence, confidence, connection, character, coping skills, contribution, and control, then ultimately that family can bounce back from anything. And I love working with these military families. I hope that the perspective that I've offered has been helpful. And I'm grateful to be part of this team in such an important work.
That was spectacular. Thank you so much, Captain Strait. People are really resonating with it, as you can see in the chat. And there are a couple questions for you in the Q&A. We're going to have to move on, but if you can type your responses, that would be really terrific.
Yes, absolutely.
That was really phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to introduce our next speakers from the Resilient Leaders Initiative, which is a social accelerator in rural communities. Vichi Jagannathan and Euldana Thorne will be speaking. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for having us, and just nice to be here and see some familiar names in the chat and stuff. So we're excited to share. I'm just gonna share my screen here. So yeah, as was introduced, we're going to be sharing a little bit today about some of the work we're doing in rural Eastern North Carolina around fostering more trauma-informed environments. And specifically, we'll talk a bit about our community-built strategy for resilience, how we arrived at this idea for a social accelerator and some of what's come out of it, and then our community board and kind of how that group offers guidance to all the work that we do. And so as a summary, I'm Vichi. I'm one of the co-founders of Rural Opportunity Institute, and we are a small organization based in Eastern North Carolina, Edgecombe County, that seeks to support youth organizations and communities in rural North Carolina to interrupt cycles of generational trauma and design innovative solutions for healing and resilience. And our goal here is really to not only create trauma-informed solutions that work in rural communities, but to also be able to build a knowledge base of things we can share with other people so that other places that face similar challenges can also learn from the work we're doing, and hopefully we can learn from y'all. So definitely like a community that we would love to continue to engage with after this conversation. And so you'll be hearing from me and also Euldana Thorne, who is a program manager at the Public School Forum of North Carolina doing resilience work, and also is one of our community board members. So she will share a bit more about that body and how it interacts with some of the work we do. So just to give some context, we are based in Edgecombe County, which is, again, a rural community in North Carolina. And I am not originally from there, so I moved to the area in 2017 to start ROI and had been there previously as a high school teacher. And upon arrival, have just been entirely struck by the strength and resilience of the region. And so, you know, we heard earlier about historical trauma, and I think Eastern North Carolina is an incredible example of historical resilience. And just to give you a couple of data points, it is home to a town called Princeville, which was the first town in America incorporated by freed slaves after the Civil War. Martin Luther King came to Rocky Mount, which is actually the city that I live in, to give his I Have a Dream speech before giving it in Washington. And since then, there has been a long legacy of people continuing to fight for and uphold civil rights and other types of movements, just like super powerful. And yet at the same time, we do struggle from a lot of long-lasting disparities that stem from trauma. And so when we first started our organization, a lot of different community members named that they wanted to understand ways that we might be able to heal from a lot of that generational and historical trauma. And so in order to dig into that, we did a community-based systems mapping process, which probably could be a topic for a different session, but basically to help people disentangle all the different forces that contribute to trauma. And so we did a lot of activities, we built this map, and ultimately arrived at this shared idea of all the different things in our community that contribute. And what we wanted to do was figure out, like, okay, given all that, where do we start? What do we do about it? And so we did this process called leverage, where you look across a system and say, like, where is there already energy for change? Where is the opportunity for ripple effects? And, you know, for our specific context, where does it make sense to intervene first? And out of that exercise, we arrived at a 3-part strategy for how our community can arrive at the reality that people wanted to see. And the first part of that strategy was learning. And so specifically building awareness in as many spaces as possible of what trauma is, how to respond, resilience-based tools. The second part was healing. And so taking that knowledge and translating it into policies and practices within existing organizations and institutions that move away from punishment and towards healing. And then finally, supporting people as they're on the pathway to healing, to staying connected to opportunities for school, work, and wealth building, with the vision that long-term, those who've experienced trauma and healed become the people that are in the position to provide healing to others. And so this is kind of like the strategy that's been guiding our work for the last 4 years or so. And so we'll share a little bit about some things we're doing to kind of act in that direction. And the first part of that really is the community board that we formed to govern that learning part of the work. And so I'm gonna turn it over here to Euldana to share more about that.
Thank you, Vichi. And so I do want to give a little background information about the community board and how it's formed. I am Thorne. I'm here in Wilson, North Carolina. I worked 14 years in the public school system as a school teacher, and then 4 years as a school counselor. Currently, I'm employed as the program manager of the North Carolina Resilience and Learning Project, which is a whole school, whole child framework working with districts across the state to create trauma-informed learning environments that are safer mentally, emotionally, and physically for all children. But specifically, I'm here today as a board member of Rural Opportunity Institute. And although I'm using the term board member, like I'm sure we hear that term board member all the time, or community board. And I invite you just for a moment to think about what comes to mind when you hear a community board. We pride ourselves in how our community board was formed and what we represent. I know personally in my mind, when I thought about a community board, my mind immediately comes to people who are, I guess, delegated or selected or nominated by a district manager or nominated by a city council member. A lot of times people who are already in high positions appoint or nominate community board members, but our process was an open nomination process, which was very important to us. Our community board members are representative of the community. We like to refer to it as maybe a cohort of community members who are speaking from a resident's perspective. And our purpose is to hold the entire organization accountable for building a more trauma-informed, resilient Eastern North Carolina. And again, that's so important because we have been able to reach more people and be more impactful and reach a true diverse, just all-inclusive population of people by the way we formed our community board. For example, when we go out into the community, if there's a single mom, you know, who's pregnant and going through trauma, we have maybe somebody like that on our community board. You know, they are real life people who are probably immersed in some trauma themselves. Regardless of your background, you can be on a community board. We found that when we're working on community issues and we leave community out of that, we're not going to be very productive because we need to model what we're saying we represent. Really brief example, I was a school counselor at the time I was nominated to be a community board member, and I was blown away. Like, I mean, not to mention, I thought, I'm a school counselor, you want me to be on this community board? And I was informed that Rural Opportunity Institute sent out a mass email. They had kind of like at that time, maybe 180, 200 emails of community members. And they sent out this mass email, like, we are looking to build our community board. Who would you like to nominate? It could be the grocery store clerk who everybody knows in the town, who greets everybody when they come into the grocery store. And so we just built this beautiful community board. We run our meetings very professionally, obviously, but also very relaxed. We start every community board meeting with a grounding activity. I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but I only have a little bit of time to share. But part of what the community board has also done, we've partnered with an amazing organization called Resources for Resilience. We have a program that we call REAP, which stands for Resilience Educator Apprenticeship Program. And community members are able to have a 2-day training where they're learning trauma-informed practices. They're learning the brain science behind trauma and resilience. And after attending that 2-day training, they have an opportunity to go to a 4-day intensive training, kind of like a training the trainer program. and become a resiliency educator. And at the time, I was a school counselor, but I also was a resilience educator. And so we learn all these great tools that we share with the community of how to heal, how to reset your nervous system. Like I can literally do a whole session on how impactful that is and how important it is to let people know that we are wired for a connection, and to let people know when you go through a traumatic event, how you respond is normal because of the way the brain science is. And so we start our community board meetings with grounding activities. A lot of our community board members are trained in resources for resilience. So we all ground together before we dive into community business. We are modeling what we're sharing out in the community. After we ground together, we usually start every meeting with the connection activity. We want to connect. We have this model of learn, heal, and connect. And so we model that even in our community board meetings. We may share encouraging words. We may share gratitude. We might watch a grounding video, but that's how we structure our board meetings as well. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of bring it in, but I guess my concept that I'm trying to convey to you all is that our community board has been extremely instrumental in how this has progressed throughout the community. We have 23 local leaders that have been certified as resilience educators, and we lead these trainings. We're still growing. And this slide is just showing you a snapshot of the knowledge building impact. We have literally reached over 13,000 members of the community since January 2020. And not only am I a board member, I can speak to the impact that the way this whole system is set up, how it grows people and it grows the community. At that time, I was a school counselor. Since then, through my partnership with ROI and the board, I landed my job as the program manager of Eastern North Carolina for trauma and resiliency because of the connections we make and how much this impacted me. And I literally started just spreading this word, and that's what we do. And it just, I don't know, I'm getting goosebumps just sharing it with you. It's that impactful. So I'm going to turn it back over to Vichi, and thank you for this moment to give you a snapshot.
Awesome. Thanks, Euldana. So yeah, after doing kind of through the guidance of the board, who really pushed us to understand which parts of the community to train, how to message the training, how to get people in, we've been able to reach a lot of community members. And what people started to say was like, the knowledge is helpful, but now we want to know when I go back to my organization and my job, how do I infuse this into the way that we are with people? Because people start to see through a totally different lens. Like now I go back to my job as an educator or a police officer, and I'm realizing all the ways that we are continuing to perpetuate some of the patterns of trauma that have been here a long time. And so that led us to work with a subgroup of the people in the training that we called a design insight group to design a program that would help us understand how it is that we might support organizations to start to embody some of the practices that we learn in this training at a more sort of structural level. And so that program is called the Resilient Leaders Initiative. And the goal is really to infuse inside institutions these healing practices. It was modeled after, and some of you may be familiar with these like Accelerator or startup fellowship type approaches. And so through my own work and some of the other people I know have learned about like a lot of these programs around the country. So if you, of course, go to Silicon Valley, there's like tons of accelerators, Y Combinator, et cetera, that are meant to help organizations in a short amount of time build some new skills and implement new things. But there are none, unsurprisingly, in the rural South. And oftentimes, even when they exist, they are focused more on like products or profit, and not so much on this like much needed healing work within existing institutions. And so our goal in building this was to take some of the best parts of those programs, but channel them towards addressing historical trauma within public institutions, not startups, and in rural North Carolina. And so with that, the Resilient Leaders Initiative was born. We ran one cohort last year and are ready to launch a second one this year. And we support, last year we supported 5 organizations, and I think the same will be true this year, to work through a 9-month process of implementing and testing out some new practices. And kind of what people go through is a first phase of just really focusing on framing the problem. And a lot of that is understanding, like, in their context, who are the people that they serve and how is it that their organization may be perpetuating trauma, but also what are the bright spots where they may be creating opportunities for healing. And so they spend some time kind of interviewing people and understanding that. And then we spend a second phase trying to figure out the right solution. So rather than jumping to like, oh, we have a discipline problem in our school. I read this thing, let's implement that. Instead, we kind of spend more time generating like, what's the whole landscape of solutions? And how do we test a bunch of them and see what actually works well for us? Because oftentimes the best practice solutions out there aren't designed for the constraints of communities like ours. And this is probably true for a lot of you. And so it's hard, like you're retrofitting some of this stuff to an environment that it was never designed for. And so instead, we're kind of encouraging people to think through how we might adapt or reconstruct some of these solutions for our context. And at the end of that, teams kind of arrive at a hypothesis or plan for what they want to take forward and sustain within their organization. And so for an example, this past year, we supported the Hope Alternative School, which I'll talk more about their specific pilot, a middle school, the courthouse, and a large church called Word Tabernacle. And so this is some of the things that they piloted, focused on a lot of different challenges, including returning citizens from prison, peer counseling. This group was looking at the Latinx population and the LGBTQ+ population, which can be overly stigmatized in rural communities. And then Hope was looking at, supporting students in alternative school. And I want to dig a little bit more into their pilot just as an example. So all these teams kind of did the testing and arrived at some interesting solutions, which we can definitely share. But in particular, Hope realized a gap where they are sent students from all the high schools across the district who have been removed from learning environments for various disciplinary reasons. And when those students arrive, they often have some of the most acute mental health and support needs, but Hope doesn't actually have its own counselor. So they have no ability to provide services to students within their environment. And so what Hope did was figured out a way to hire their own counselor, and they are able to, within state rules, bill Medicaid for students who seek services from this counselor such that it pays for itself. And so through a bunch of work have started to piece together like how it is they can both provide services to students in a way that is accessible, that isn't stigmatizing. They've like renamed it. I don't think they call it a counselor. They renamed it the position to something else. They redesigned the intake form, but separately also figured out how to navigate the billing process, which you can imagine is like a major beast. And so there's a lot of paperwork that needed to happen on the student side to be able to access that stuff. And we've sort of been trying to design ways to make that easier. But ultimately, the hope is that a program like this could be one that other alternative programs across the state and potentially in other states with similar policies would then be able to replicate to fill the gap where we often don't provide mental health services in the places where they're needed most. So that's just one example, but our hope is to run another cohort this year and continue to come up with practices in these contexts that we could then share with folks like you all to replicate. So I think with the like 60 seconds that are left, just wanted to offer contact information. So if you're interested in funding or supporting public institutions in our community as they go through this process, if you're interested in receiving training from the group that Euldana showed, or if you want to learn more about some of either the Hope pilot or some of the other ones that people have been working on, please feel free to reach out to us and would be happy to share more. Euldana, was there anything else that you wanted to make sure to share in the remaining time?
No, I couldn't do it in like 30 seconds, so I better be quiet. I just get super excited when we talk about this.
That's great. That was very exciting and very instructive in addition to being informative. So I'm especially excited about it because it's happening right here in my own state. So we definitely want to be able to work together and expand and scale the initiatives that you're working on. It was really, really excellent. Thank you so much. There may be questions for you, so if you would please check the Q&A. And there have been just a lot of really terrific comments in the chat. So thank you. Okay, I am going to bring Kay Bain into the Zoom room. Hi, Kay, how are you?
Hello, thank you for having me.
Absolutely great to see you. So this is Kay Bain. He's going to talk about his violence interruption work in communities with high rates of gun violence in New York City. So Kay, take it away. Let me know if you need anything, okay? I'm
All right,
right.
let me get my screen
Okay.
together so I can share.
Yep. I'll stay on until you're set.
So I may or may not be using my PowerPoint. Let me see, recently.
We're all good. We're all good.
Okay.
You see a share screen green button at the
Yeah,
bottom?
I'm in it. I'm actually looking for the document that my team
Oh, I
prepared
see.
for me
Okay.
moments ago. And
Yes,
I don't.
thank
I
you,
don't see it.
Susan. The Susan says we've all been there, Kay, so no worries.
That's all.
Someone from the audience, or they're all saying it's
Okay,
all good.
It's okay. All right, so let's proceed. So my name is Kay Bain. It's a privilege, pleasure, and an honor to be with you. I am the founder and executive director at Community Capacity Development 501c3. We are a human justice and healing organization located in New York City, but working nationally towards transforming lives, and specifically in communities of color. Our mission is to uproot systemic challenges. Let me start from the beginning and go back. Around 2009 or 2010, I had the privilege of working as a legislative and budget director in New York City Council. At the time, we got a $4.8 million investment from then Speaker Quinn. It was not an easy amount of money to get or an allocation to retrieve, but we did. And in doing that, we set up pilot programs around the city of New York, now affectionately known as the Crisis Management System. We've grown that investment to over $100 million in the last decade or so. Oh, I think, one second, I think I'm getting some support to find the document. So when I share screen, I think it's underneath. It's all right. I'll run through it off memory. So again, Crisis Management System, 2010, 4.8, close that, $4.8 million investment to $100 million. 5 pilot locations that then became now, I think, over 50 to 60 organizations that my group provides training, technical assistance for around the city of New York. Again, we work in Miami, North Carolina, et cetera. But what do we do at CCD, at Community Capacity Development, this incredible human justice organization? So we focus on sustainable growth planning in communities of color, communities that have been marginalized and disinvested in. Now, one of the most effective ways to do that is to look at violence, because violence is undeniable. Violence is a byproduct of disenfranchisement, as many have said before, and the traumas that we have suffered in our communities. So we're known as an anti-gun violence organization and initiative. We're known as that. We're known as an anti-racist, anti-poverty organization. I think one of the reasons that we gained national recognition and attention was because in Queensbridge houses, with many who are familiar with New York City will know, it's the largest housing development in North America and arguably the world. Well, we went to Queensbridge houses and we did some things there that hadn't been done in other spaces and affected 365 plus days with no shooting, no killing in that housing development. Now, me being a Brooklyn boy, that's an accomplishment, because to those of us who do this work, we know how hypersensitive many of us in these communities are. Sometimes we grow up in 4 to 6 block radiuses and don't leave those. I know people in New York City from Brooklyn who have never left the borough of Brooklyn. These are grown women and men, but again, operating inside of that silo, that 4 to 6 block radius. How did we work with the community to produce such an outcome? How do you, in the largest housing development, again, federally, the poverty rate is around $24,000, $26,000, depending on your family size. In Queensbridge houses, it's $13,000 to $15,000 per year median income. Look at the fact that the wealth gap in white and black families. In a white family, average median wealth is $142,000. In black families, it is approximately $11,000, right? With this type of hyper segregation that exists, unfortunately, in 2022, what steps did we take to make ourselves the most effective human justice site in the city of New York and now nationally recognized? So first thing we did, and I heard presenters before me talk about the importance of need assessment, of going into communities and asking the right questions and listening. Something as simple as that, I think my group, in terms of being community capacity development, in terms of being organizers, we really take pride in our ability to listen and to work from empathy. We have a saying, when you start at human, then justice is a possibility. But when we start at criminal, in terms of criminal justice work, we very rarely end up in a position in which justice is acquired. So we are, again, a human justice organization, and it's built into the way that we approach these challenges that I'm speaking of now, the trauma that we're all speaking about now. So let me give you a little bit about what a human justice organization requires or is built on. So we have a theoretical framework that says human rights plus human development leads us to human justice. It's an equation. Human rights plus human development equals human justice. Well, the rights component of this conversation is built on the fact that every human being, regardless of gender, geography, economic status, regardless of creed, color, is a precious gift. That life has to be respected and be treated with dignity. So that's first. Human rights, we have to be made aware of these rights. We have to be given these rights forthcoming, just on the basis that we are born into this world as human beings. Full stop. The human development component of this means that it's about resources, but not just throwing resources at our problems, at the challenges in society. Not just saying on paper, we're going to move this much money from this part of the Excel sheet to another. The development component of our equation talks about how specifically those who have been removed from opportunity, removed from access, removed from power are positioned in those exact positions, not to be at the table, to lead the conversation at the table. So again, human rights plus human development leads us to human justice. We also have a methodology that's called CSI, and that deals with community empowerment as a component. It deals with system change and individual transformation through direct services. And what's interesting about our methodology, I find, is that it requires us to approach these three distinct areas simultaneously to be most effective. So in any initiative that our organization leads, you will see a component focused on, if it's policy work, research, you will see community empowerment at the helm of what we do, simultaneously working on system change, which is policy, legislative work, research, and also the direct services. So we do those three things, and we do them very well at the same time. When I look through history to find effective movements and change where it was needed, I've noticed, and we've noticed, that these three things, these three areas have to be intersected intentionally for the work to be effective. Something else I say, I think recently, big news for us, because we've been replicating our work, again, in counties and cities and states around the country. We've been doing a lot of this work pro bono. We see organizations that need help. As our name kind of implies, we're about developing the capacity. So we'll go to organizations and we can teach human justice, which is one of our trainings. We can teach and train in diplomacy, which is a specialty area for us. We can teach and train in these areas, but also there's the back office work that has to be done. And some of our leaders in our organization, like myself, had the privilege of working on a $90 billion budget as city council for many years. So we bring some of those experiences of the behind the scenes that smaller grassroots organizations like ours need, and they need to be built internally for greater capacity. When we, again, touch into supporting organizations and communities of color, We are there from a position of empathy to listen, to learn, and then to suggest and recommend the proper support. And I just want to highlight the word support because I think it gets used a lot. Terms like support and engagement get thrown around a lot, but they're not really happening in ways where we can see the maximum effectiveness. I think in this work where we're dealing with people who are traumatized and there's intergenerational oppression that people are struggling and fighting through, we have to really be honest about what support looks like. And support looks like what it should look like from the position of the persons being served. So again, myself, my story and where I come from to do this work is a survival mode mentality. I'm someone who did not have much, came from a community where violence was the norm. And so now I work in communities where you are 7 to 9 times more likely to be shot and killed on a daily basis. And we go in with our lived experience as what we call real models, not role models, but people who have been through some struggle themselves. We can share from a position and a place of, this is what I've experienced. In addition to the research, in addition to the academic support, we're coming from a place where empathy is key and central to the work that we do. I want to be mindful of the time and leave time for questions. But I just want to leave you with this. A couple of weeks ago, I got a call from the White House and Joe Biden, well, actually his representative called and said, Bain, the president would like to speak with you. So I said, well, put him on the phone. And they said, no, not like that. He would like to sit down and have a conversation with you about the work that you've been doing in New York City, but around the country. And I said, okay, instead of us going to the White House, would he mind coming to the projects, to the housing development, where I've done a lot of my work, or to the school that is in the ghetto where I've worked for the past 6-7 years. We had a school, PS 111, that went from failing on all levels of measurement to now being one of the most successful schools in New York City on all levels of measurement. And so they agreed. And so about 2 weeks ago, I met with President Biden in New York City at a school that we work with the young people. Again, there was extreme violence in this area and in this school building over 5 years. It no longer is the major challenge that it was. And so I was supposed to speak with Biden for about 20 minutes about our work, our model, how we replicate it, and what we have to offer the country. We spent over an hour on live television worldwide talking about human justice and healing from the perspective of those of us who lead at community capacity development. The following week, I was training groups of probation officers in the city of New York, and we got a call from Obama who said he would like to open or close and give remarks at one of our trainings, a virtual training. I said he can give the training opening, he can open it, he can close it. But all that to say, the attention after a couple decades of this work in growing the crisis management system and now building what we call the Human Justice Network, where we're looking for Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, marginalized community group organizations to be leaders with us in this work. It's our time. And so the attention is now coming, and we are prepared and ready to replicate and to put our learnings and lessons and better practices out to the world. Last thing I'll say, I spent the month of January writing a manuscript that I want to give for free in June called The Elected Officials Guide to Understanding How to Completely Stop Gun Violence, an elected officials guide on how to stop gun violence, not reduce it, not send it back in the other direction, how to completely stop it. And I'm saying that in full confidence because we've done it. We know what's required and we've demonstrated. At this point, it's evidence-based. So I want to thank you. I'm going to stop there. I want to thank you all for your time. My name is Bain, and Community Capacity Development is my organization. We are building what's called the Human Justice Network. Thank you. Any questions, I am available.
Okay, thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. Your leadership in this space is so appreciated. You're getting a lot of love in the chat if you want to read through those. And there's also some questions in the Q&A. If you're able to type and respond to those. Any other questions that folks have, please do put them in the Q&A. The chat really does move quickly, and I'll agree with Tamara. No slides were needed. at all. You spoke through the subject matter so well. If you're able to share those slides, we're happy to put that into our resource center that we are developing for all of the workshops. Feel free to email that to us and we'll get that to everybody.
I just want to quickly thank
Please.
you for a platform that allows leaders like myself and others to have a network, to be able to hear, because I'm learning as I'm here and I'm happy to share, but it's always great to have like-minded experts and leaders so that we can draw on each other's energy. You know, this work is very fulfilling, but it's very draining at the same time. So I thank you, Doctor. I thank you so much for the invitation and I look forward to working with you soon and often.
Absolutely. I'm already planning to follow up with you very concertedly. This whole domain is of great interest to us, and I want to know much more about your work. Yeah. That was spectacular, and I agree with everybody. You did not need slides. That was probably the better way to do it. So thank you.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you. And to what you said, as the chat and Q&A both sort of are exploding, so feel free to read.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we created this because there was a need for a cross-sector sort of platform to share the universe of the work that's going on. Because like we're hearing today, and like we've heard in past sessions, the work that so many thought leaders and passionate individuals are doing is just incredible. And we know that with the platform that we've provided, that we aren't even able to cover all of the work. And so we thank everybody that's in the audience, others that aren't able to present during this workshop series, and recognize that in future years and for future sessions that are to come after this particular 9-session workshop series, there will be so much more thought leadership to share, and we will continue to find ways for you to lend your voice, your expertise to the movement as we continue to grow together.
Right.
We are about an hour and a half in, and
I just want to, say too, just like thought and action leadership.
absolutely.
I always like to have the action term in there because that's where we're going with this.
Thank you.
But yeah, no, I appreciate that, Jesse.
No, it's all about the action, right? I mean, the research is all very, very necessary, but how we put that into action and really influence and improve people's lives, communities' lives, how we improve and change systems is so critical. That's why we do what we do.
Yeah.
And so with all that was shared in the first part of this session, I want to invite folks to take a few deep breaths. We are going to do some exercises from my little brain break book. And so for the breaths, and I also want to invite folks, if you need to step away, go to the restroom, we're going to return and resume in about 10 minutes.
Yeah, please stay on. We have some spectacular speakers yet to come.
Yeah, so please stay on, but feel free to step away, take the time that you need if you need to go to the restroom. But for the brain breaks, we're going to do 2 different ones today. Or we'll actually do 3. So Denny, I'm going to ask you to cue up some jazz music because that was certainly getting love in the chat. And we'll do about 5 minutes of a jazz music exercise after our 2 brain breaks, our 2 first brain breaks. And then we will all become conductors or dancers. I will invite you all to do whichever feels best. But the first brain break, which is an energizing brain break, is called Lion's Breath. So what we're going to do is take a deep breath in, and then we're going to open our mouths as widely as you can, stick your tongue out towards your chin, and release all your breath with a roar like a lion. Please remember that you are not on camera, so feel free to look as crazy as you want. I will try to model that. We are going to do it 3 times. I hope that I don't look too insane, but also it's all good if I do. So we're going to take a deep breath in, and then let it out. Folks can let me know if I am a good lion or not. I would assume that it is not. So we will go ahead and try it again. Take a deep breath in, and then go ahead and roar. That was not a good one. That was not a good one for me. We'll do it one more time, and we'll continue to work on this and figure out how to roar like a lion. Take a deep breath in. Nah. Again, sort of pulling these out. Didn't have a lot of practice with the roar. Maybe I'll stay away from those in the future. Probably will. The second brain break is going to really, I'm glad that it's entertaining. The second brain break is going to really activate our midbrain a little bit. It'll be a little bit more relaxing in this. So what we are going to do is we are going to draw large letters in the air, but instead of saying A, we're going to say 1, 2, 3, and we'll go up to 10. Or with time, let's just do the whole alphabet together at your own pace. This is a good way to sort of separate what we're drawing and what we're saying. Again, it activates that midbrain, a deeper brain state, helps us relax, think a little bit. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. Again, that's an easy activity that you can do with students, with anybody else. It really helps to calm and regulate. I hope that you found that as well. And then for the rest of our brain break time here, or for the next 5 minutes at least, I'm going to ask Denny to put on some jazz music, and we can do one of two things, or again, you can take the time as you would like. I invite anybody who wants to get up and dance, move around to the jazz music. I also invite folks to become their own conductors to the jazz music, especially for those who may not be as mobile, may be having back problems, lower body problems. It may be more comfortable to simply compose music, but whatever you want to make of the next 5 minutes of soothing jazz music, I invite you to do so. And we look forward to being back together for the next presentation right around 2:40. So Denny, if you don't mind starting the music, that would be fantastic. I want to invite folks to start coming back to the session. If you're still dancing, feel free to continue to dance through the music. Denny, I'm wondering if you want to join me on screen and begin to introduce the next presenter for the session.
Yes, he's coming. Ali, is this a good time? Well, we have 3 more minutes. Let's wait the 3 minutes.
I'm good, Denny.
Are you? I mean, we do have 3
Yeah, I'm
minutes, so just to stick.
You know,
with
I
this.
mean, I'm not going to make it home in 3 minutes. So I gotta, actually, I'm parked in the church parking lot. And there's actually a hawk sitting right in the tree right in front of me. So I got a good view.
Oh,
that's beautiful.
That's a sign of hope.
That is a good omen.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Well, so you are due to speak in 2 minutes. So I just want to wait
Okay.
another couple minutes while people roll back in.
Should I turn my camera on now? Or wait until you turn
Yes,
it
you're
on.
certainly welcome to turn your camera on. We'd love to see
Okay.
your
Just make sure I got a good
faces.
angle.
Yeah.
It says I can't start it. I think you have to
yes,
start it,
let
or whoever
me-
the host is.
Yeah, I turned you off because I could see you steering. I could see you were you steering the car. There you are.
Yeah,
Hi.
I'm just good. How you doing?
I'm okay. Yeah, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, always.
Yes.
Holly, let's be good.
Oh, poor thing. So Jesse, Ali had to race his puppy to the vet, and so that's why he's calling from the car. Ali, the exact same thing has happened to my dog twice, and it's extraordinarily painful until they can get it out. So
Yeah, and the thing was, it wasn't bothering her at all until they ripped it off. So like she was fine. I didn't even notice it until my cousin came by to pick something up. She's like, "Oh, is that blood on the floor?" I was like, "Why is there blood on the floor?" And I looked, it was just like dangling, and I was gonna rip it off, but I was like, "Well, Holly, we're good back there." Yeah, but yeah, but I could hear her like yelping in the back when they tore it off and cauterized it, and then they were like, "All right, well, she's good now."
Oh gosh.
But yeah.
Yeah, so it's a nail that came out of a nail bed.
Oh.
Yeah, like yeah, she cracked it at some point while we were at the dog park this morning.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Would it? Yeah. Do you feel comfortable moving ahead with the presentation?
Oh yeah, I'm totally.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah,
cool.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I'm totally fine. Yeah, I got.
Totally
I mean, like I
cool.
said, I found a cool church parking lot. I got a hawk right in front of me, and she's fine, so I'm good.
The hawk is fine.
I'll go off
Yeah,
camera,
my
but know
dog's
that we're all thinking about it.
Okay.
We're
All
loving
right.
it.
I'll get started then, Jesse, and introduce Ali, my bud. Ali Smith, and we've known each other for how long?
It's been a
15,
long
20
time,
years.
Denny.
20 years.
Pushing 20 years, yeah.
Pushing 20 years. So my favorite people in the entire world. So for everybody else who is listening, because we're just having a chat here, this is Ali Smith, and he founded and directs the Holistic Life Foundation in Baltimore City. And he will tell you about his work in Baltimore and around the country and in other countries, I assume, and with bringing mindfulness to children with a high rate of poverty. Children who live in poverty for the most part and have a high rate of trauma. So Ali, I'm going to turn my video off and it will just be you, okay?
Okay.
I'll be in the background if you need anything.
All right.
Okay.
Okay. Do I need to save some time for Q&A at the end, or do you want me to?
You can do whatever you want with your 20 minutes. So if you
Okay, I'll
want to
probably
stop
leave the last
early,
5
we can
minutes
do Q&A. Yeah, that'll be fine.
Yeah, I'll probably leave the last 5 minutes for Q&A. That's cool. Okay.
Okay.
So hello, everybody. I'm Ali Smith. I'm like I said, I've known Denny for about 20 years now. We go way back. So it's good to be joining her here. Actually, that's about the time we started the Holistic Life Foundation. Actually, 20 years ago, this month was when we did our first programs. My brother and I and our other co-founder, Andres Gonzalez, started the Holistic Life Foundation fresh out of college. Me and my brother grew up with meditation in our home. We grew up in West Baltimore, right where actually the Freddie Gray uprisings happened at a different time for Baltimore. I think pre-crack, where it was like a really, it it was a neighborhood. There was a lot of love there. There was a lot of support there. You knew everyone. So there wasn't when I grew up in Baltimore, it wasn't as traumatic as it is now for kids growing up in Baltimore. But I did have the yogic base. Meditation every morning before school was just how my dad made it. I mean, me and my brother didn't really have a choice because he was like a basketball coach and a teacher, and he was pretty strict. So meditation was something that we did every morning without question. So we got out of it after our parents got divorced, and then later on in life got back into it as we were finishing up at the University of Maryland. We saw how much the practice affected us, and we wanted to share it with other people. And I'm sorry if you all hear my dog in the background. She's a little antsy from running out of the vet. Yeah, we wanted to share the practice with as many people as possible. So we started the Holistic Life Foundation. And when we did, we weren't really sure who we were going to serve or how we were going to serve them. We just knew that we wanted the mindfulness practice to be a part of it. That might be a good move. She doesn't like the front seat though, so it's gonna be a little difficult. And plus she's like 61 pounds now, so that makes it a little more difficult. But yeah, we started with this small after school program, actually because of our mom, the one that introduced us to Denny. She was running this program called Paths, promoting alternative thinking strategies, run by Dr. Mark Greenberg. And actually I'm gonna step out of the car. Run by Dr. Mark Greenberg. And the way it worked was the principal there actually, can you all still hear me?
Yeah, you're coming through well, Ellie.
Yes, all right, cool. All right, so yeah, so Dr. Mark Greenberg was running the PATS program, or he has the PATS program. My mom actually started working for the program at a school called Windsor Hills Elementary School. And while she was there, the principal came to him and was like, hey, she saw myself and Andy Gonzalez, our other co-founder, picking up from school like on most days. She's like, well, what are you guys doing? Can you guys coach football? We decided to do an after-school yoga program instead, which yoga was close to our heart. And we started there. From there, we moved on to, like doing more programs around the city and serving other populations. I think our first population outside of schools is in drug treatment centers. Because Baltimore has historically had a huge problem with drugs and drug abuse for many reasons. And yeah, so we went from there, and then the organization started to grow from there. It definitely brings inner strength and peace. I think that was one of the things that we saw and wanted to share with other people, because like I said, when we moved back from college, we moved into the neighborhood we grew up in, actually the house we grew up in. And we noticed that, it was one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the United States at the time we were living there. We don't live there anymore, but we were living there at the time. And it was one of those things where, like our friends would come out and see us, and we were dead broke because we had just started an organization. We were just starting a business. We were living in that neighborhood, which was home to us, so it didn't really bother us. But we had this sense of peace about us, and our friends would wonder, like, well, how are you all this, like, happy, like inwardly and outwardly, and you guys are broke and live in this neighborhood? And we were like, well, you're miserable, and you've got money and live in a nice house, so there must be something to this. So I think in the beginning, we didn't really know what trauma was. We thought there were just a lot of bad kids. I mean, we had no experience working with kids before we started the Holistic Life Foundation. And I don't think we realized that there was something deeper going on until one of our students, he's actually doing really well right now. He was in that first group back in March of 2002, and he refused to close his eyes to meditate. And we were like, well, and back at that point, we were like, we have to close your eyes to meditate, like, come on. And he would do whatever he had to do to get put out of class right before the meditation. He'd do the physical practice perfectly, he'd do the breathing perfectly, and then he would just do whatever he had to do to get put out of class before the meditation, because he didn't want to close his eyes. And then one day we actually took him home, and we saw what was going on at home with him. We were like, oh my gosh, like, no wonder this kid doesn't want to close his eyes. So we started to scratch our heads. We let him meditate with his eyes open. Eventually got comfortable enough to meditate with his eyes closed. But it's one of those things where we knew that something else was going on with some of these kids. Like, there was we didn't know about trauma back in 2002 at all. So we were just trying to be trying to figure out things that we could do to support the kids in the practice in a way that felt comfortable for them. I guess we were trying to be trauma informed before trauma informed was a thing, because we just cared about the kids and we loved them. We wanted to help them. I think from there we started moving into more school-based interventions that were whole school, particularly our Mindful Moment program. It's a viral video that keeps popping up about turning detention to meditation. So that's that program where kids get referred to the Mindful Moment room to center themselves and then go back to class, trying to change it from more of a punitive experience to an empowering experience. You know, kids are used to getting punished and getting in trouble for stuff, but why not empower them by sending them to the room, and letting them see questions. Most helpful for explaining the program and seeing the puppy. Okay. We can definitely see the puppy, and I can definitely talk about that.
You go ahead and address the questions at the end, Ali, if that's more
Go back to my
comfortable.
Zoom.
You can address the questions at the end if that's more comfortable.
Yeah, so the Mindful Moment program, and then I guess dealing with trauma with kids was something that's kind of like at the forefront of what we did and what we were doing, because so many kids were dealing with trauma in Baltimore City. And I guess everywhere, but it just seems more prominent in Baltimore City. From like we've worked, like Denny said, all over the world, and I think Baltimore has had the most. It seems the kids are most affected by trauma here. Like I noticed when we go other places to teach and to train, and they give us their problematic kids, they don't have as much going on as the kids in Baltimore do. So I think it just had to be, once we figured out exactly what was going on, we had to figure out ways to work with it. And I think the first thing that we always do is, working with the kids with making their body a safe space, because that's important. I don't think you can really work with kids who are doing any type of mindfulness work and not make their body a safe space first. It's actually impossible. I mean, people have definitely come up to us and been like, well, hey, I did a mindfulness meditation with this group of kids, where they just sit in silence. The kids are coming out crying. They're trying to figure out what's going on. It's because the kids aren't safe in their bodies, and that empty space allows for that trauma to come up. So we always start off with some physical practices, and we always start off with some yoga first, whether it's chair-based or mat-based, working with that proprioceptive input to make sure that their body isn't sending their mind fear signals all the time. And it's beautiful to see once a kid can actually sit still and their body does start to feel safe, because we've dealt with kids who just have been through some traumatic experiences and their body isn't safe to them. So to see that transition is an awesome thing. Like I said, we always make sure that we never do silent meditations with our students. All the meditations are guided. That way the kids can learn about inner peace, but it's a safe inner peace and not like a vacuum of like stillness, because that's not safe to the kids that we're working with. So you got to be able to, we do all guided meditations. Thank you. We do all guided meditations, and it works out well for the kids because they learn inner peace. And I think another thing we work with the kids on, besides the guided meditations, we give them a lot of choices. There's a lot of people who have been traumatized, they don't really have choices, and their power's been stripped away from them. So we don't do adjustments in the poses, like we don't move the kids around. We might give them a gentle suggestion about what they might want to do to enhance their pose. But we don't do physical adjustments just because it's taking the power away. We use a lot of reciprocal teaching because it helps the kids, again, with empowerment and self-esteem. Like the kids come to the front to lead. So like when you come to our programs, you see the kids leading a lot, and it actually helps to take ownership of the practice. And that's the way we've been most effective at bringing the practice out into the community, is through the students that we teach. Like without a doubt, there's always students that go home. It's usually for stress. I feel like stress and anger. Like if their parents have had a rough day, they'll take it out. They'll try to take it out on their kids. But our students are smart enough to be able to identify what stress and what anger look and feel like, and they'll stop their parent and sit them down and breathe with them or meditate with them and lead them through the practice to kind of nip it in the bud before stress or anger goes downhill towards the kids. I think another thing that we really do, like I said, we care about the kids, is treating the kids with love. I know we had a conversation with Dr. Bessel Vanderkolk, and one of the things that he was telling us was that there was one thing that could help that would always work in healing trauma, except for like traumatic, like brain trauma, like a brain injury. But we were trying to figure out what it was. And he's like, well, you guys already do it. And we were like, well, what is it, the breathing? Is the meditation? Is the yoga? And he's like, no, man, you guys treat the kids with love. Like love is the thing that heals all forms of trauma, like that connection. So I think it was good to hear from someone that's a trauma expert. It's something that we felt, but we didn't really have any proof of, but it was good to hear it from someone like him. And it was good. I think long term, another thing that's really good about the practice is it gives the kids an inner resource. Like a lot of times kids don't have resources around them, or they don't have any place to go. Like they can't go to a retreat center, they can't go on vacation. They're stuck in their home or their neighborhood, which may be chaotic. But if they have that inner resource and that inner peace, it's something that no one can ever take from them. Like if they can find strength and resilience within themselves, and they can also find peace within themselves, it's a tool that they always have with them. Like there's tons of students of ours. I wish that I could say all of our students succeeded, and all of our students went on to work for the Holistic Life Foundation, or go to college, or have a job. Like we've worked with tons of kids that ended up incarcerated. I mean, that's just the reality of their lives. But the best thing about it is that, like they'll write us or call us from jail, and they'll say the one thing that's keeping them sane in there is their practice. Like they always revert back to the practice. They'll revert back to the breath, and they'll revert back to their meditation. I don't think they feel comfortable enough doing postures when they're incarcerated. No one's ever mentioned that one. But the breath and meditations are things that they can always do, no matter where they are. And it's a very inconspicuous practice. Like it's something that no one will know that they're doing. So they always jump back to the breath and the meditation in any situation. So yeah, and definitely not it was definitely funny. I just saw someone mention bad kids, and we definitely thought when we first started work, like again, we had never worked with kids before. We had never heard of trauma. We were just three guys that cared and wanted to do some good work. And it was one of those things where we're like, man, there's a lot of bad kids out there. Like these kids are, but I mean, we didn't know about executive function and the prefrontal cortex and trauma and like like we had no idea about any of that stuff. But I think it made us feel better once we did learn and could articulate. And I know there were a lot of people that would talk the amygdala, exactly. And so it was like all these things that were going on. That I think it was good for us to be able to articulate so that we could train better in facilitating these practices, because it was things that we were doing, and we were just kind of instinctually, because we saw what was having a positive effect on the kids. You figure, I don't know, I guess like 10 or 12 years in, we had trauma informed down because we were just doing what was working with the kids. Like we knew that a physical practice helped the kids become safe in their bodies and made breathing and meditation a lot easier. We knew that we can't have silent space in the meditation. Like there's things that we learned by trial and error, but just being present, being able to being empathetic and being compassionate and loving our students, it wasn't hard to figure out with enough time and working with enough students. I guess I can open it for a couple of questions.
Ali, to start, are there resources or materials that you could recommend? And if it's easier when you get back to send it to Denny and myself, we can just add that to the resource center.
A couple of what I can recommend?
Resources.
Yeah, I've definitely got some resources. If you all check out our website, we've got some awesome stuff on there as far as programs and trainings and stuff. I mean, because like I said, we've been doing this for almost exactly actually it's March, yeah, so 20 years now we've been doing this. So we could definitely be a really good resource for anyone that's interested in bringing these practices to kids or adults who have dealt with trauma. I mean, because the practices are meant to heal, and they do heal. But the thing is, like, you got to be teaching them in the right way, or you can do more harm than good when you're working with them.
And what has been most helpful in expanding your program?
I think actually training the kids that we work with to be teachers, and that reciprocal teaching model. Like our young people are used to being instructors, very early on. Like when you come, if you ever come to after school program, you'll see kids as young as 4 leading the practice. So they're building their confidence, they're learning the practice, they're learning how to teach the practice. And then we go back and we train them. And I think one of the things that actually we weren't too happy about was, I think Ottman, Andy, and I stepping away from direct teaching and stepping into the office to build our organizational capacity and build the infrastructure to be able to do stuff like that. And someone that's on here, Phil Leaf. Phil Leaf was awesome at helping us expand. Like he would, back when we couldn't get help from a lot of people, like he would bring us down to his office on the weekends, and he knew we were vegetarian. He'd have like Indian food there for us. And he would teach us about how to expand, because we cared, but none of us went to school to run a nonprofit. So we didn't really know what we were doing. And he definitely was instrumental in helping us to expand and grow our programs.
Yeah, Phil has done tremendous things in Baltimore City. He'll be speaking in our last panel.
Yeah.
So he'll be talking more about the policy aspect, but he has just really helped to institutionalize a lot of programming and new thinking about trauma and so forth throughout Baltimore City and in the state of Maryland.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that question was actually asked by Phil Leaf, so I don't think that he meant to set himself up that way, but that works out well.
I don't know if I've ever actually, I don't know if me and Ottman and Andy have ever actually talked to him about that. But yeah, he's definitely one of the people that's very, very instrumental in us being able to expand what we were doing and start to grow.
Yeah, I just want to make the point that this kind of practice is what is called normalizing prevention. It's called the culture of prevention, where we're really incorporating what we know and have learned about. Oh, look at that. Oh, precious. Sorry, I just love animals. Precious. So yeah, it really embeds these practices into our daily lives and teaches us how to interact with one another and with our young people and within ourselves. And it's all interconnected. And I think that's such a perfect archetypical example of how we can really start to be trauma informed in our daily lives.
Ali, we just want to thank you. There are so many things that I want to lift up, but when you said we were just a group of guys trying to do good in our community, I think that that's empowering for everybody on this call. I know that many people are engaged in coalitions or organizations doing this work, but as we continue to learn more, and you expressed how you learned throughout your process and grew, there are always opportunities for people to get involved and help out to make the world a better place in their community. Advocacy on a broader scale, it's real important, and that was a great example. So thank you so much for your presentation and for being with us today and for introducing us to your puppy. We certainly hope that she is feeling better.
She's good. Soon. She's good now. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm sorry I was in the car and trying to get everything situated, but I Denny's pretty much family at this point, so I had to make sure that I made this happen.
And tell Ottman I'm waiting with bated breath to hear about the new addition to the family.
Yeah, she's still cooking. She hasn't made a move yet, but I would definitely let him
any day now. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you, Ali.
All right, everybody have a great weekend.
Be blessed.
You too.
Take good care.
Next up, we have a wonderful leader in the Native American community to discuss Native American and historical trauma, the work that she does. Tami Decoteau. Tami, thank you for being with us. I would love to just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here real quick. All right, Jesse, can you guys see those?
Yes. Yep, those are coming through.
Get this up here. Okay, so I just want to spend a little bit of time today talking about historical trauma for Native Americans and kind of what that is and some of the major ways that it's impacted our communities today. We probably all now know the definition of historical trauma, which we consider this sort of collective, cumulative wounding, emotional, psychological, spiritual wounding of a group of people due to genocide. This is very different than the kind of trauma that somebody might experience if there was warring between two groups of people. And a lot of times I sort of hear that pushback, well, the Indians, there was a war between the Europeans and the Native Americans, and the Native Americans lost. And that's really not what happened, that there definitely was some warring, but the colonization and the genocide of the people involved a very long history, a couple hundred years of the US government creating policies to completely eliminate an entire group of people through various strategies that were genocidal, including the oppression and the elimination of their cultural ways and their religion, etc. So that's very different than the kind of trauma that occurs when two groups of people war. The transgenerational trauma is also referred to as intergenerational trauma. I'll kind of use those terms interchangeably, but we know that when large groups of people experience genocide, they tend to have some common symptoms. And some of those common symptoms are difficulties with mental health, substance abuse, behaviors that tend to be violent. And we can look at almost any indigenous population in the world and see some really a lot of similarities, whether it be the Sami from Norway or the Maori from the Australian area. Sorry, I'm in a school today. They're doing announcements. And we're going to see those similarities. So those kinds of behaviors, and then that are passed on from generation to generation and continue to perpetuate the trauma, are referred to. People often ask me, was there one genocidal policy that was maybe more problematic or more harmful than others? And my opinion is most definitely. And that was the boarding school area that lasted for well over 100 years into the 80s in the United States, and another decade or decade and a half in Canada. And we're hearing some about that now nationally and in the news and social media. But this was particularly problematic because Native children had a need for attachments, and not just person-to-person attachments, but they had a need for multiple attachments because the culture was collective and holistic. They had very meaningful attachments to their people and their extended family, but also to their culture and their language and their spiritual world and the land, and particularly to their land, their place of being, because we believe that our culture is in the land, our ancestors are in the land, and we have a ceremony in a certain place. The energy from that ceremony is available for continued healing even after the ceremony ends, and all of the things that sustain us are in the land. We know through research, and what the previous presenter talked about was the importance of relationships. And so attachments of any kind for Native children were buffers against stress. They were things that made Native children resilient. And when they were taken from their Native environments, their homes and their place, all of those attachments were broken. All of their meaningful attachments, the things that helped them understand how to be who they were, and the things that built their resilience and buffered them against trauma disorders, were removed. And then they were placed in these very militant-like boarding schools that used corporal punishment, the separated siblings, so they were unable to even maintain sibling relationships often. And as we are learning now, were places of really horrific abuse. Many children died in these institutions from abuse or disease or simply loneliness, but the ones that survived then came out of these institutions with really complex trauma, really severe trauma. And we can only imagine what that did to their brain development and their little nervous systems, let alone their ability to accurately perceive themselves or their world. And then they had to go back into their communities and try to figure out how to be parents, how to raise their own children, how to be partners. And really all that they knew was how to be abusive. That's what they were taught. That's what was done to them. And so then this began this legacy of difficulty in parenting and engaging and raising children in this emotionally connected way, or sometimes even in a safe way. And that continues to pass on generation to generation unless there's targeted intervention. So when somebody goes through this kind of trauma, their nervous system has a tendency to get stuck in a state of vigilance or alarm or even fear. And a lot of people who have suffered early childhood and complex trauma are really stuck here in vigilance and alarm. That's where they exist all the time. And as you can see in this diagram, the parts of the brain that are required to function for thinking, planning, self-control, the things that we need to be able to do in our work, in our family, and our school are in that purple area. In order to get to that part of the brain, which is the very upper and frontal cortex of the brain, we have to be in a calm state. And that's true for anybody. If you've ever had a moment of fear or panic, you've probably experienced that you had trouble recalling really easily familiar information because that part of the brain just kind of goes offline for a minute. So if you're somebody who's experienced trauma and you're really stuck in vigilance and alarm, then you're always having trouble really accessing the parts of the brain that are necessary for functioning well in any environment. And then it's just a hair trigger to a full-on alarm, a full-on fear response. And if you exist in vigilance and alarm for a lengthy period of time, that's really where paranoia exists. And so people begin to not just feel hypervigilant and have this exaggerated startle, but they really begin to experience the world as this place that's out to get them. And they begin to develop this sense of paranoia and inability to trust others, which leads to a whole nother host of problems with building relationships and seeking help. If you don't have to be somebody who experiences panic or fear or alarm for too long to know that you probably couldn't survive there for very long without feeling like you're really losing your mind, or without attempting to reach for something outside of yourself to calm yourself down. And so a lot of our substance abusing population is also individuals with histories of trauma that were not able to develop the ability to self-regulate and are stuck in this sort of alarm state, and they're trying to find something to calm themselves, to gain sleep. You know, sleep is all about relaxation, and so if we can't relax because we're in alarm, then we're not sleeping. If we're in alarm state, we have chronic exposure to stress hormones that breaks down our bodily functions and leads to disease over time. And so we have to remember that when we're talking about trauma-informed strategies, step number one is engaging people in activities such as mindfulness and in calm, safe relationships so that their bodies can calm down enough for their brains to work the way that they're meant to. Another interesting aspect of our nervous system is this sort of vagus nerve that runs through our body. And this is a little bit more complex than I'm going to talk about it today, but for just discussion, we'll kind of break it into three basic parts. We have a really healthy part of this nervous system that tells us to go find help when we're in trouble. And so if our brain perceives threat, and perceived threat may not be actual threat. So whatever we experience in our life, our brain will associate with threat. And then when our brain perceives that again, it will send a threatening signal tell our body to go into a fight or flight or freeze response. But the first stop that signal stops in a healthy body is the upper thoracic region in the social engagement area. And it's the part of the body that says, you're in trouble, go find your safe person. We've probably all heard the story of the brave soldier that cried for his mommy and during battle. And that's not because he suddenly was not brave, or it's because this part of the nervous system was triggered, and his association and recollection of his safe person was his mother. And so this is a very reflexive response, just like our fight or flight system is very reflexive and survival based. It's really healthy part of the system. But if that individual is somebody who has, particularly as a child, grown up in a situation where help is not available, or they've tried to reach out for help and help has been denied, then this part of the body kind of stops working. It like goes dormant, so to speak. And when the fear signal comes in, then the next stop, they go right past social engagement, which is also why people with trauma have trouble asking for help, because it's the part of the nervous system actually doesn't engage. And so it's a physiological reaction rather than an actual choice. So they really have a hard time asking for help, but it goes right into fight or flight, goes right past social engagement, right into fight or flight. And this is where aggressive defense is, right? Everything in the body speeds up. It makes us faster. It makes us stronger so that we can survive. But if we're stuck here all the time, then we're always in a defensive oppositional mode. And physiologically, the only response the individual can give is an oppositional one. In fact, they've done studies on people who are kind of stuck in this nervous system response. And when they give them prescribed medication, the body is much more likely to reject it when it's in defense mode. And so we see that with our youth and our trauma population, is it's like they're always trying to fight us, and they're always oppositional, and they're always arguing because they're physiological stuck in that system. And until they do things that and receive interventions that teach their brain to override that system, they kind of almost can't have a different response. So, but sometimes when people have repeated experiences of not being able to get out of a difficult situation. So fight or flight is sort of the part of the body that says, like, you're in trouble, help is not available, you're on your own, like figure this out on your own, solve this problem on your own. But if we can't solve the problem, if we've had multiple attempts, we fail, the nervous system gets overwhelmed. And there's a point that the nervous system will basically say, all right, help is not available, you're not getting out of this, there's no way to solve the problem. So self-preserve, save as much energy as possible and immobilize. And that's where this sort of what we refer to as freeze, or which is really more like collapse, where everything in the body slows down and sensation disappears here. Some people would call this a state of shock or learned helplessness, but there really isn't much pain, if any, but there's also not much emotion here, if any. So people who are stuck here will talk about a feeling of numbness, as if they don't exist, as if their world isn't real, and they're not experiencing fear or pain or depression, but they're also not experiencing joy or peace or happiness. There's just sort of nothingness here. And this feels really yucky to people. It feels like they're not existing. These are the individuals that are harder to treat because you have to spend a lot of time doing somatic work to help them establish safety in their body. And you have to do that very carefully and very patiently. And they're also the individuals that are more likely to engage in self-harming behaviors, because when they do that, they get this little boost of adrenaline that for a moment pops them up into fight or flight, and then they can feel again. But so much of our Native population, because what they have been through, is in this collapse state, or what we would also refer to as learned helplessness, where they're really having trouble moving their bodies. Their thinking is slow. They're not accessing the parts of the brain that they need to be more successful or resolve their trauma. And so that says a lot if you're in a helping profession about exactly what level of help and scaffolding do people at this level of trauma need. And it's probably a lot more than is available to them. We all at this point have heard about the Adverse Childhood Event Study, the study 22 plus years ago now that was helped us understand the association between early childhood adverse events and disease and early death later in life. And we are now beginning to understand the mechanisms that contribute to that disease and early death. I'm not aware of ACE's data that has been completed and published on Native Americans. I think we're getting close because I know there are some studies underway. But what you see on the left is the pyramid for the non-Native, the general population. What you see on the right is the proposed pyramid for Native Americans. And what you see there is that they have all the same layers of the pyramid that the general population does, but they also have two additional layers, which is the generational and historical trauma, and then the social conditions and the context of all that, even before we get to the ACEs. And so Native people really sort of come into the world already with some predisposition to disease and early death, and also mental health difficulties that go along with that. We now know through, as we are learning, beginning to learn through epigenetics research that traumatic responses, which are usually stored somatically in the form of sensory information, can be passed on intergenerationally. In some animal studies, it's found that they can last for up to 14 generations. So for Native people, none of this stuff is really new. We've talked about this in our traditions for always and ever, that we've understood that what we experience needs to be healed, or it's passed on to our offspring and continues to affect us. So this idea that, well, you know, the genocide happened in the past, you guys just need to forget about it and get over it. It was a war that you lost. It just doesn't hold up in the research. It doesn't hold up in the trauma literature, and it's not how the body works when it's been exposed to genocide. We know that in order for trauma to be resolved, there needs to be targeted interventions that are culturally sensitive, and that include all the variables of trauma-informed care, which are establishing safety in the body, establishing safety in relationships, and learning how to self-regulate. And what's really great about the trauma literature is that it really validates Native American traditions, because it's telling us that some of the best ways to do that are those rhythmic, movement-based sounds, dances that are all part of our culture already. And so that's very validating to us as Native people. So I'll stop my slides right there. And I think I have a minute or two if anybody has questions.
Dr. Decoteau, I'm wondering if you can very quickly, with the last minute or two, just explain sort of the work that you've done in schools. I know that Dan talks about it very, very regularly, and some of the amazing turnarounds that you've seen, and if there are just any practical tips that you can offer to our participants in terms of how they can reach out and sort of what some of those first steps can look like.
Yeah, I don't know if you... Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yes, so I do quite a bit of consultation with school systems to help them build trauma-informed schools. That involves a period of teaching about the science. We usually do a piece on teacher self-care, historical trauma, kind of whatever the school needs, and then helping them design their system to be consistent with the trauma-informed strategies, and then teaching the teachers and the educational staff how to recognize trauma behaviors in students, what they look like. There's a term we call catching it low, where you notice when a child is beginning to go into that alarm state, and before they're in total fear, you're going to provide an intervention that really disarms the amygdala. And again, it's very, like, the priority is based on relationship. Ollie talked about choice, because we're giving back them a portion of the power and control that they can manage so that they can feel safe in their bodies. That's where behavioral change occurs. What teachers learn is that, first of all, when children are traumatized and they're not in their upstairs brain, all bets are off for learning. And then a lot of time and resources are spent on managing difficult behaviors. So while there's some teaching and learning on the front end of how to do trauma-informed strategies in a school system, it doesn't take long for schools to begin to see really positive outcomes, and for teachers and students to be a lot happier, a lot less stressed. We have learning brains in the classroom, and children are learning new behaviors and healing from their trauma. It's really been fascinating. I wish I had more time to talk about some specifics about that, but it's really been fun to watch how our Native communities utilize their cultural traditions to create healing ways in their school system, and how beneficial that is to children, even in terms of like school attendance, school performance, just overall teacher morale goes up. It's been fun to watch the creativity in the school systems.
That's tremendous. There's
Thank
been
you.
an awful lot of chatter in the chat with a lot of input. We will organize what we hear in the chat with the resources that are being submitted and try to respond to questions after the fact or make note of anything that's really that really needs to be brought to the fore in our resource material. But Tami, this was of such great interest and so very fitting for this panel. And I hope that whatever resources you can provide, you'll send to us and we'll put on our resources website. This was tremendous. As you can see, everybody is talking about what an awesome presentation it was, and we thank you. Really thank you for, and clarifying what seems to be not well understood about the history. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and if there's I see a question in the chat. I haven't looked to see what it was, but if you can type your answer, that would be great. And then we can go to our next panelists. And they are Drs. Susan Rose and Tom Lebel from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And they're going to talk to you about incarcerated and substance-dependent parents. So take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen at this point. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. I want to start. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Susan Rose, and I am a professor emerita at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the Helen Bader School of Social Welfare. We're, Dr. Tom Lebel and I today are going to be talking about research we have conducted with women in jail. Really builds off a number of studies in the past 15 years. So, okay. We want to give some background about this. We're going to be talking about, especially today, a recent study of trauma among women in jail. And I connect it somewhat to the idea of historical trauma, because as you begin to see, these are women where there's multi-generational trauma, and they really have trauma as children, trauma as adults, and then the incarceration, trauma related to their incarceration. So just some background is that we're going to try to make data a little interesting to you today as well. So what we know is that women, we've known this for a while, who are entering jail have pretty high rates of trauma. It could be physical trauma, sexual trauma, or crime-related and mental health challenges. Oops, I need to do that. Some incarcerated women do experience post-traumatic stress disorder, but in particular, they also experience, and this is not discussed much, trauma and victimization while they are incarcerated. This is really re-traumatization. This can be by staff. Women are sexually and physically victimized by criminal justice staff, as well as other incarcerated women, other inmates of a jail. So they often, when we think about the fight or flight, they're always on alert, this hypervigilance response for their safety, and keep what we call a prison or a jail mask on by not in order to not show their emotions. Our work has been primarily in jails, and I just want to say there's a big difference between jails and prisons. Most of the literature you're going to see is about women in prison. Jails have a much shorter term of confinement. There's many more women who go through jails than go through prisons. And about 80% of them stay for even less than a month. They're sentenced for misdemeanors, low-level felonies. These are not women who have committed more serious crimes. Jails are usually closer to an inmate's home, which means that they could see their children or family more often, and they do not. And we'll explain a little why that is. Over 9 million people are jailed every year, as opposed to in prisons about 1.3 million. And those numbers have been reduced because of COVID. And these jails are operated by county governments. So the project we're going to discuss today is, this is in Milwaukee County Jail. within about 30 or to 45 days of their release, we screened women who agreed to the study for substance abuse problems, trauma, and stressful life events. We have a final sample of 110 adult women, and we screened them using, first of all, the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale that you're familiar with, the Stressful Life Events Screening Scale, which talks about stressful life events or trauma as adults, the K6 Distress Scale, which you may not be as familiar with, which really looks at, it's been used a lot in incarcerated populations to look at psychological distress as a result of incarceration. And then we use the audit, the Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, which was, it's a screening measure to determine if there's probable likelihood that someone has a substance abuse problem. So I just want to give you just a peek on who these women were that we talked to. They were about 33, 34 years old. Most of them had been in jail already for about 90 days, or that was the mean number of days they'd been in jail. Over 50% were Black, non-Hispanic. About 33% or so, a third of them were white, non-Hispanic, and about 16% were Hispanic. A whopping 68% of these women were mothers of minor children. In other studies we conducted, if we looked at mothers of children, minor children and children who were above the age of 18, that percentage grew to about 80%. Most of these women had at least a high school degree or a GED or some college. And so we'll talk, I want to jump down to this one, this positive audit score. What this means is that the screening for substance use, over 70% of them had the likelihood that they had a substance abuse problem. I'm going to hand it to Dr. Lebel to talk about the measures and some of the data, and then we'll go back to recommendations.
Sure, thanks, Susan. So one thing I want to just mention is we focus our research here locally in Milwaukee on incarcerated women, often because women are, in a sense, forgotten in the prison and jail systems, because the vast majority of incarcerated people, right, are men. So they definitely don't get as much, attention. So the measures that I'm going to be reporting on again are the ACEs, which people are very familiar with, and Tami gave a great summary of their impact on people's long-term health risk behaviors, social problems leading to disease and early death, as well as the stressful life events screening questionnaire, which really measures lifetime exposure to traumatic events. Some of these may have occurred in childhood, but many of these have also occurred in adulthood. So some of the results, I know I'm not seeing the results on the right side of mine unless I kind of click the image away for people. The important thing to note with this, right, if you think of these 10 measures looking at abuse and neglect, the first 5, and the last 5 more around household dysfunction, all of these had response rates of more than 40%, except for one of these. And then the overall score was 4.5, and the research strongly indicates that those scores, especially over 4, are most impactful negatively on people's lives and on these women's lives. And then just a couple of these we just highlighted about people not feeling that you were important or special, issues around parents being separated or divorced, the ACE in itself of having a household member go to prison, right? The impact on children with incarcerated parents, over 40% themselves, and Susan kind of mentioned that intergenerational factor involved here, living with someone that was a problem drinker or alcoholic or someone who used drugs, being over 50%. So just highlighting again just the tremendous amount of adverse childhood experiences for these incarcerated women.
Right, and just the magnitude, it's not one or two, but it's just numbers of them. It's quite a few, so.
So the stressful life events, again, some of these could be, have occurred in childhood or occurred later. So, other folks earlier today talked about, foster care or adoption. And you'll see on here 25% of these women, said yes, right, that they'd been put up for foster care or put up for adoption. The amount of violence that these women have experienced is really tragic when you look at personally experienced violence in a relationship, basically 75%. Having seen a robbery, mugging, or attack take place, 50%. Having actually been robbed themselves, mugged, or physically attacked, not sexually, by someone they didn't know, a stranger, over 50%. Being shot or stabbed, right? 20%, of these women. So it really highlights, these issues, or this one about, have you ever been in a war zone or feel like you've been in a war zone? And obviously, right, we're all probably seeing the, the tragedy that's occurring in Ukraine right now, in a real war zone. But these women feel like they are experiencing that. And yep, I see in the chat, right, an incredible amount of domestic violence in their lives.
We were talking about this, 20% say they've been either shot or stabbed. And we were speculating how many people in the general population can say. Certainly it's not 20% have been shot or stabbed, so.
So the K6 Susan had mentioned, so it's really a 6-item, inventory that really asks if they've had these feelings, certain feelings, none of the time in the past 30 days, or up to all of the time. And it's really kind of capturing depression and anxiety. So some of the results you'll see here, I'll just really talk about the highlighted ones in particular. I mean, it asks again about nervousness, hopelessness, being depressed, everything's an effort, feeling worthless. But the 42.7 number is kind of the cutoff for serious, mental illness, or issues around depression and anxiety. So an incredibly high percentage. And then if you see below that, so the follow-up questions are taking all feelings together. How often did they occur in the past 30 days? And this gets at kind of the impact of jail, as the average of time that these women had been in jail at the time of the interview was 90 days, about 3 months. But you'll see that more than half are saying, more than usual, right? So kind of indicating, again, the stress of the environment, having to interact with, the other women in a closed space, the staff, potential victimization, even if that's, theft of some sort, and other things are having an additional impact on these women. So just to summarize, I mean, we did regression analyses and other things which people don't need to see, but what really comes through is, women with more, that have experienced more childhood adverse experiences, as well as these other stressful events, also are experiencing greater psychological distress during their incarceration. Another bullet point on there that I think is important is reported they had fewer jail incarcerations, but more days in jail. So the longer they're in jail, right, they're experiencing kind of more psychological distress. But also if they're, say, it's their first time in jail or their second time, compared to someone that, unfortunately has been in and out of jails or prisons more often, those women with less experience of that are suffering more, right? That it's more traumatic. Around the other issues, I think the important thing that also came out of the last presentation as well is just the intersection for these women between substance use, mental health, and physical health. So in other studies, kind of before this one, with women in the same jail, about a third indicated all three, right? That they screened, suggesting a serious substance use issue. They've had mental health treatment or in the past, and they noted a serious, physical health issue, which oftentimes was, asthma in particular was really high, in this population. I think I'll turn it back over to Susan now.
Okay, see if I can. So we wanted to talk a little bit about recommendations based on this. One is that we just think it's critical that all women who enter incarceration, especially in jail, should be screened for the presence of past and current trauma. And this is not being done at all. So jail staff have no idea what kinds of experiences women have had. In some ways, they may not really want to know some of that. We also think that social workers who are working with correctional populations really need to address not just childhood trauma, but adult trauma among jailed women, that these women have past, present, and ongoing trauma as a result of that. So just focusing on the past is not really going to be of great help to them. Jail is an opportunity. Women are not in jail for a long time, but there's an opportunity really to teach women more effective coping strategies while in jail to help them manage the effects of trauma. Jails really, I'll tell you, women just sit there in many jails because they're there for short periods of time. And that's the difference between prison and jails. In prison, there's a lot more time to work on this. In jail, there's not. So to really just work on coping strategies is helpful. We put down here some evidence-based gender responsive programs that really should be provided to incarcerated women. My guess is many of you working with incarcerated populations are familiar with them, but if you're not, Lisa Najevitz's Seeking Safety and Stephanie Covington's Beyond Trauma are two programs that are really very helpful. And the last one I want to emphasize is that correctional staff really need to receive training in recognizing and addressing the behavioral manifestations of trauma. Otherwise, they just see it as this woman is obstinate, this woman is not adjusting, she's to jail life, and not really understanding what the effects are of trauma in her daily interactions with other people, with jail staff and other people. So we want to strongly emphasize that that is a recommendation that we would make. I want to take 1 minute or so before we go to talk about children of incarcerated mothers. And this is that intergenerational, that transgenerational trauma that we see here. And if anyone has any doubt of it, I encourage you to look at Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration. But children of incarcerated mothers have a lot of trauma. One, oftentimes they'll see a mother arrested and detained. Think about this, you're 6 years old and here comes the police and they haul your mom away in handcuffs behind her back. That's pretty traumatic for kids. Kids have limited communication and visits with mothers. In the last 5 years, many local jails have stopped in-person visitation with young children and gone to video visitation, which doesn't mean a lot if you're a 2-year-old child or a 3-year-old child to see your mom on the screen as opposed to a physical encounter. However, we know that some relatives don't even reveal that a mother is incarcerated. She's away, she's somewhere. Kids have to change residences, schools, familiar areas, and oftentimes they are separated from their own siblings. So we have some specific recommendations for children of incarcerated mothers. One is that they're able to have consistent contact with the parent during their incarceration. Jails often charge much more money for phone calls between inmates and their families. They can be up to 10 times the amount of that it would cost you to make that same phone call, so that they just don't happen. 5 years ago, Cook County in Chicago made a profit of $750,000 off of inmate phone calls, which is just incredible that such a thing is allowed to happen. Police should ask about minor children at the arrest and make provisions for their immediate care. Oftentimes they do not. If the kids are there, they'll take them to the station and then kind of look around with where we're going to find a relative to take them. Or that if they take a mom during the school day, kids might return home and mom isn't there. They don't even know where she is. And we want to emphasize that children of incarcerated parents ought to be included in reentry planning. And the last thing I want to talk about is really strategies. We're really taking a macro approach here to change in policy and practice. One, we think that the impact of childhood and adult trauma has got to be documented in incarcerated populations. We've been doing that, others have been doing that, but I think more and more we have to do that to bring this issue to the front. The impact of incarceration on symptoms of depression and anxiety has to be acknowledged by professionals who are working with incarcerated populations. And that data that links this kind of trauma with the likelihood of recidivism has to be widely disseminated. The truth is, as much as we think everyone likes to read our articles in professional journals, they surely don't. So that we're talking about disseminating this information in the popular press, in other professionals. If you are in a school, there's school newsletters that go out to be able to get this information out to everybody. And in order to make the change, practitioners have got to form relationships with criminal justice professionals to build trust and facilitate communication. We were very fortunate that a report that we gave to the superintendent of the Milwaukee County House of Correction, we worked with an agency there and presented that report to them. They were then able to use that report to get additional funding to hire a re-entry worker at the jail. So these relationships can be very powerful, and you can be seen as helping both the women and the jail staff in monitoring that. And so I'll just end with these two quotes. For some prisoners, incarceration is so stark and psychologically painful that it represents a form of trauma severe enough to produce post-traumatic stress reactions in the free world. Because incarceration reshapes beliefs, perceptions, and mindsets in a very negative manner, leading some formerly incarcerated persons to believe that people will always treat them with suspicion and will never fully accept that they've paid their debt to society. And that is certainly the case as long as we continue to have the stigma of incarceration. In Wisconsin, there's a move to what they say, ban the box. So when you go to apply for a job, you don't have to mark, have you ever been incarcerated before? Because the stigma is so strong. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
So that was so very important on so many levels, and you made so many excellent points, the intergenerational nature of it. Not just through modeling, but through epigenetics, the imprinting, the trauma that just has long-lasting effects on the individual and subsequent generations is something we have to address. But I also think, in addition to that, that you bringing out the systems abuses, this is what we very much want to do in the course of this workshop, is not just talk about individual level trauma, but it comes from systems and structural drivers as well. And we don't want our systems that are there to serve to further traumatize us through corrections, through prisons and jails, and through our child welfare system, our foster care system, and so forth. So it really just tied in so nicely. And I just want to say this one thing. I know we're over and we want to have plenty of time for Sherrie, but just that when I was long time ago, I developed a program called Baby Talk, where I was teaching prenatal care and parenting to the mothers in the Baltimore City Women's Annex of the detention center. Hardest thing I ever did in my life. I had to compose myself before I could go back to work. It was so tough. And one day I became so frustrated. There were about 60 women in this room with me with no air conditioning in the middle of the summer. And so everybody was hot and bothered. I was so concerned that I said, how many of you were abused as children? And there were a few hands. And I said, okay, wait. I said, how many of you were beaten to the point of unconsciousness before the age of 12? I literally had about 80%. maybe 85% of the women in the room raised their hand, because atrocious crimes have been conducted, and you want to cast aspersions, but when you find out about the cycle of violence, you cannot. And that's what we really, really need to bring out. And we really do, need to have the compassion for these women and the environments in which they come from, and so that we don't repeat our mistakes. Susan?
I'll just follow with that, because many of these women are in the public, I think, are thought of as the most unsympathetic of all. People are, how could you do that? How could you do that to your children? And that we've even seen that with our students say that. And there's not a lot of sympathy for mothers who are incarcerated and expose their children to that. And there needs to be much more.
Right. We need to recognize what the systems and structural drivers are. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. There's a lot of chatter going on, so I'll let you take a look. But
Yeah,
Jess,
Susan-
go ahead.
Susan and Tom, there are some questions in the Q&A, which, if you don't mind, just type in some responses to. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Like Denny was saying, we really need a comprehensive vision, and we hope to lead that, and we would love to help elevate your work outside of just professional journals whenever that is possible and appropriate. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And last but certainly not least, Sherrie Rickerson. Sherrie, if you're able to, there you are, has just an incredible story that really is going to tie so much of what we've heard here together. And Sherrie, I just want to thank you in advance for being here with us, sharing, and also for the great work you do with so many other families and individuals who are in similar positions to where you were and are. And so thank you in advance, and we're excited to hear your story.
Thanks. So I think I've been invited to share because I have 10 ACEs, and the fact that I'm okay is, I've heard people say it's miraculous. I would call it a statistical anomaly. And I'm also here to tell you that there are things that we're doing, and the trauma responsive movement is something that can replicate that. Some of my earliest memories are of watching my stepfather beat the daylights out of my mom, and of me never being good enough for her not to hit me. My mother gave me and my brother better than she ever had. And I learned at an early age, there was nothing that I could do to not get the belt on pretty much a daily basis. My repeated early childhood messages were that I was bad, I deserved it, and I was not worth anything. The few times that I was removed from my home for abuse, I was returned in ways that left me in danger, such as a phone call, which my mom recorded and let me know that she would get to me before they did, or interviews in public places with my parents, with my mom. More often, I would passively show that I needed help through papers that I wrote at school, comments that I made. I would change out and make sure that the bruises that I had could be seen. And more frequently, there was no help or investigation coming. I was kicked out of kindergarten and second grade. I scored in 8th grade between 94th and 98th percentile nationally for math, English, and science. I was reading at a college level. I couldn't read a map to save my soul, though. It was like 34th percentile. So I was identified as gifted, and I was told that I was too much of a problem and I didn't belong in the classroom with gifted students, because my behavior would hinder kids with real potential. I remember in 8th grade is the first time I tried to run away. I snuck out my window after mom had locked my brother and I up for the night. The only friend that I hadn't had these like really amazing, gentle, caring parents. And it was a safe place for me to go. And they, being upstanding citizens, helped me call the police, who promptly gave me back to my mother, who called the Texas police officers Bleeding Heart liberals. I slept in the closet that night with my mom's bed in front of it, and we moved that weekend from Texas to North Carolina. I slipped into depression. I was told by my mom that my suicidal thoughts that had me hospitalized was just a cry for attention. I began cycling through running away and going to juvie, the shelter home, back home, run away, the whole thing. And eventually I was declared incorrigible and placed in state's custody to spare my mother from me. I wound up in a co-ed group home. I remember foster home tryouts, and I was not a kid that was worth keeping. I wound up in a co-ed group home, and as happens in many co-ed environments, I found myself desperate to leave that space that housed a person that harmed me. Despite begging repeatedly to be moved, I was told there was nothing available until I kicked in walls, threw fire extinguishers through windows, and generally destroyed anything I could get my hands on. I got put in juvie again, and I was offered so many options, and I refused them all. I was convicted of destruction of private property on February 14th as a minor, and I was emancipated into adulthood on February 15th. I had no license, ID, car, job, place to live. And I was free, and I was so happy because I had finally won against a system that I felt like had never cared for me. So I walked out of the courthouse with this little box that I had of everything that I owned, and I was feeling good. And I sat on this little bench in front of the courthouse holding my little box, and I realized I didn't have any place to sleep. As little flakes of snow started falling, like, I'm not trying to be dramatic, but this moment just sticks in my life a lot for me. So I got out my little piece of paper and I started unfolding it. And I called one of my buddies that I had met in juvie. And he's like, heck yeah, Sherrie, come on over. So I went over to my buddy's house, and he was a good friend. He was the kind of good friend that would give you the best that he had to try to make you feel better. And I was high before the sun set on my first day of adulthood. I spent years angry at systems that didn't take care of me. I exercised my freedom in ways that hurt me. I had no idea how to navigate life. I consider myself blessed to have overcome addiction before I had my kids, and I had nothing to fall back on to help take care of them. This path eventually led me to having 2 children, 2 absent fathers with drug and alcohol and domestic violence history, tons of fear that I was a bad mom. I was very ashamed of myself for not being better for my kids. And I was living in poverty. I felt like a failure. I knew I never wanted to hit my kids, but I never knew what I was supposed to do with them. I call it parenting in a void, right? So like you've got this screaming kid and you don't know what to do. I didn't hit him and I didn't do well. I was at a point where I was probably 2 weeks out from losing it all, and just terrified somebody was going to see how worthless I was and take my kids away. And I was invited to join a program called Step MC that was addressing poverty in our community. I kept testing these people who were supposedly creating space for me. And I kept waiting for them to give up on me and for their system to hurt me also. And as I began to say all the ways that I had been hurt and all the reasons why I was angry, instead of being met with justifications and blame of, you are responsible for yourself now, I was met with affirmations of, you're right, it's not okay. It's normal to be hurt when those things happen, and you deserve to be safe. I developed a deeper understanding of how systems trap good people that care about people like me into processes that do not care about people like me. I finally began to heal. Nobody at STEP MC gave me the path or the answers. They did walk with me while I learned to navigate life in a different way. They helped support me in overcoming barriers, like figuring out how to do full-time work and parenting and school. I wouldn't be where I am today without the relationships that I developed. My kids developed a lot of trauma. My son was really good, identified as gifted, incredibly bright. He was consistently pushed to excel. I didn't have a lot of problems with him. And in retrospect, he didn't get the attention that he needed when he was younger, and that's why I paid the piper in his teen years. My daughter, on the other hand, she was wild. Let's see if any of this sounds familiar. She was almost kicked out of kindergarten in 2nd grade. She kicked teachers. She hit me. She was removed from the gen ed setting for 95% of the day. Her principal told me that although she was dual identified as gifted, as well as, the other issues, the advanced math program that her testing score said she qualified for, it was for kids who were going to grow up and be doctors and lawyers. He couldn't allow her behaviors to hold the other kids back. Don't worry, it didn't fly. She went. Through all of this, I was learning about ACEs and resilience and how it wires our brains. And I was beginning to see that my daughter wasn't giving me a hard time, she was having a hard time. When you start having information about what to do instead of just like what not to do, parenting gets a lot easier. I also know firsthand that it's possible for adults to heal. I spent years angry that I was continually put back in an abusive environment until I got better. I now realize that if somebody in my childhood would have seen my mother, a woman with no coping skills, overwhelmed, with 2 kids, and a disturbing childhood that makes everything that I've talked about here look like we were talking about going out for ice cream. If she'd have been seen, and if she'd have been helped, and if she'd have been heard, and if somebody had made her feel safe, I could have had a different life. I did apologize to my kids for some of the mistakes that I've made. I don't offer excuses. Not good is not good enough. And I love them, and I'm healing, and I support them, and they'll do better than I have. I now am blessed to work for STEP MC. I get to be the affirming voice for other adults struggling with poverty and trauma. I get to be the person who says, I know it's dark and there is hope. I get to give what I got, and I get to give what we all give, which is the best of what we know. Personally, my life is calm. I own a good car and home. My daughter was on AB honor roll last semester. I can't remember her last meltdown. She's happy. She works at a library. She giggles. She loves books. I have no idea what that childhood is like, and I'm so grateful. My son is in the dorms at a state college. He recently texted me and asked me what I thought about him getting a tattoo today. And that's normal stuff. We're happy and we're safe. Holding space for people, adults and children, and understanding the trauma responsive movement. That's what helped me be where I am today. And I am so grateful to have the opportunity to give that back sometimes and to share with you today. Thank you.
Sherrie, thank you. So many things to pull out. And I just want to say, I know that it can be difficult to share that way, but the vulnerability, the story of hope, as well as the trauma that was so clearly experienced is so critical. I hope that you take a chance to look in the chat. I saw you glancing down somewhere or sometimes, but there is clearly a tremendous amount of value that you hold in a lot of people's lives, those that you work with and those that are watching you on screen, many who you may never know. So thank you for being here with us and sharing. I look forward to getting to work with you and get to know you better. Like I told you when we met first, the story that we really want to tell is that we know that ACEs are not predictive at the individual level, right? Like you said, I mean, an ACE score of 10 and yet you're thriving. You've created a safe space for your kids. The story that we want to help tell is of people who have taken action, learned about the science with high ACE scores and said, I am not going to pass that on to my kids. I am going to, with this information and with the skills, like you said, to create a better future for them, create a different pathway forward, stop that cycle of intergenerational trauma. And your story is one of so many that is so powerful and healing and important for us all to hear, not just how we can support individuals, but how our systems need to transform so that way we are helping everybody reach their full potential. So from the bottom of my heart and Denny's and everybody else's, thank you for sharing with us. I do encourage you to read through the chat. I just see a ton of hearts, which will probably—
Just a lot. It's going really fast.
So you will see so much affirmation and love in the chat, Sherrie. I think I'll keep the webinar open so you can read through it. It just, while our hearts hurt while we heard you talk, they also were joyful when we saw the support and we see how well you've done. And I think what we need to know, like there were some people earlier in the session that were saying, well, there's no coming back, not with respect to your talk, but others, certain amount of trauma, there's no coming back. But, that's what resiliency is about. And that's what we want to foster here. How do we find the opportunities through systems change and change in our knowledge and awareness and practices so that we can have a route to come back? But at the top level, we don't want people to experience it in the first place. So while we need to mitigate the trauma when it does occur, what this workshop series is also about is how to fix the systems, how to address the structural drivers. It's not just, at that individual level, to avoid saying what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you and what did systems do to encourage that or allow it or ignore it and neglect it. So we really want to hit it at all fronts. So those are both of our lines of defense. One is mitigation, but the other is let's not have to be resilient, because to be resilient means it's in the face of adversity. Let's try to reduce the adversity through policy change.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were just—
I'm really grateful for that.
Now permanently in my heart, just as Jesse said.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Sherrie, I just want to lift up your comment of to the question about what did you say to your son? If you just want to leave with that happy note, it's a fantastic response for any parents who ever get that question from a child.
I told him that he is smart and he is capable of making good decisions. And I believe that he understands the long-term implications of getting a tattoo. And so far, he does not have one.
You've empowered him to make a decision on his own. So thank you for sharing that. That was funny. I'm
not doing that fight. Nope.
So this has been a fantastic session. Thank you to everybody who presented. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Sherrie. Thank you all so much. I want to share in the chat. I will share it a few times, the Zoom link to join our breakouts where we can discuss and sort of come together after each of these sessions. You can find that on the NPSC website, but again, you can join us there at that Zoom link. We will have breakout rooms and then come together after about 45 minutes for a 15-minute group discussion. What did we learn? That will be facilitated by myself and my wonderful colleague, Whitney Maris. We want to invite everybody to join us in 2 Fridays on March 18th for a conversation about building the movement with foundations. And we will send out more information on that. And just a reminder, that on March 16th, we will have our next CTIP CAN call, which you can find more information on our website. And I will also be sending you all information ahead of time about that call. So thank you so much, Denny. I will turn it over to you for any last comments you have.
Oh, thanks, Jesse. I think we've commented enough, and people have been so gracious and staying on with us. And I want you to get to the breakouts. So just, be on the lookout. We're sort of shifting and, making sure that we're making adjustments based on evaluations and reaching everybody that we possibly can. Please be sure to send these announcements to your networks and your colleagues and friends and family and, other people that you encounter in your spheres of influence. So next time we will have more about CTIP and the campaign and what the future we're hoping will look like, and that we will pursue collectively with all of you at side by side, hand in hand. So thank you again.